nighttime. Whenever you appear is the right time. Waking, sleeping, this heart of mine is in your keeping. I feel such an aching the moment I awaken. My heart is bound to break in two. Hankering, just hankering for you.
Someone's rocking my dream boat. Someone's invading my dream. We were sailing along, peaceful and calm. Suddenly something went wrong. Someone's rocking my dream boat.
Good afternoon. The Planning Commission meeting will come to order. Ms. Rodriguez, would you call the roll, please?
Commissioner Schwartz.
Here.
Commissioner Peugeot.
Here.
Commissioner Lodge.
Here.
Commissioner Jordan.
Here.
Vice Chair Campanella.
Campanella.
And
here.
Commissioner Higgins.
Here.
Chair Thompson.
Here. Okay, do we have any requests for continuances or withdrawals or changes?
No, Mr. Chair.
Any announcements or appeals to bring up?
I have just one brief announcement. Next week, the Planning Commission's regular meeting will be used as a special work session, and that will be held at 1 o'clock at 619 Garden Street on the third floor. That's the Water Resources Conference Room. It will be a regular meeting of the Planning Commission, agendized and posted, with the focus of the meeting to be on some roundtable discussion topics to work through with the Planning Commission and staff. And that's it for announcements.
Okay, thank you. Now we come to the point where we can take public testimony from people who are out to talk about something that's not on our agenda. We have one speaker slip, Leslie Wiscombe. Hi.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the Commission. I'm actually here wearing two hats today, so you'll see me later on. But I wanted to bring to your attention a partnership that we formed quite a while ago when the drought was declared, and that's with the UCC Master Gardeners of Santa Barbara County and the City of Santa Barbara Water Conservation. And we've put on a series of workshops which have been very successful and heavily attended by the public. They're all free to the public. And we have an upcoming workshop called Gardening in the Drought, a symposium. And if you'll allow me to give each one of you a flyer, it's going to be on Saturday, January 24th, and it's at the Louise Lowry Davis Center. And it's on a variety of topics about gardening in the drought and should be of interest to our home gardeners. So I'd like to offer you an invitation to attend one or all of the lectures throughout the day, and it should be a pretty exciting event. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have a comment, a point of contact for the public that might want to be
yes, it's
aware,
on.
Yeah, but I mean, for people who are listening on the TV might not see the handout. Do you have a website or a phone number?
Yes, well, it's on the flyer, but the flyer's been very well advertised. I've sent it to all the neighborhood committees. The city's advertising it. It's on EdHat now, and if you go online, you'll be able to click and get right to the flyer with all the schedule of the events for the day. And there's also, I believe on the flyer, an email address at the bottom if someone wants to email, and a phone number if someone wants to call. That phone number gets you to the Master Gardeners of Santa Barbara County who can provide additional information.
Okay, just for people that don't see the flyer, 893-3485 if they want information.
Yes, that's the number. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Any other public comments? We'll close that portion of the agenda and move to item number 3, the recommendation to the City Council on the Capital Improvement Program. Just to point out, a reminder to everybody, the items that are on the CIP have been vetted by staff and the various boards and commissions that are responsible for the functional areas. Our role is to review for overall compliance with the general plan and make a recommendation, move it forward to the City Council. Ms. Brooke, you going to give the presentation or staff?
Good afternoon, Chair Thompson and members of the Planning Commission. I'm Rebecca Bjork. I'm the Public Works Director, and I'm here today to introduce this item. The Capital Improvement Program is the work of all of the departments of the city. Public Works takes the role to coordinate it, but I do want to emphasize that it is a document that is developed in coordination with all of our department staff. And as your chair informed you, it is taken through all of the different boards and commissions ahead of compiling the draft that you're seeing today. I also wanted to mention that the City Council has appointed a subcommittee to look at infrastructures very pertinent to the Capital Improvement Program, which is looking at the infrastructure needs for the city. And to that end, they have been conducting a number of public meetings to get input from the public about how to prioritize our infrastructure needs, and also to help educate the public about the shortfall between the resources needed to adequately maintain our infrastructure and the resources that are currently available. That subcommittee will be making a report to the rest of the council on January 27th at the regular council meeting. So I hope that you'll be able to see that online or in person, and I just wanted to alert you to that because it's very relevant to the types of things that we're talking about in the Capital Improvement Program. Within Public Works, the person responsible for pulling all the work of the departments together is Brandon Beaudet, who's here with me today, and he is going to take the lead role in walking you through the document. We also have representatives from many of the departments that have put together the Capital Improvement Program who are here to answer specific questions if you have specific questions about projects in the document. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brandon. Thank you.
Brandon?
Chair, members of the Planning Commission, good afternoon. The Capital Improvement Program is an important document for our city. Shown here is an example of a completed project in 2012. We see some before and after pictures of some repairs done to the Conejo Road after there was some damage by some active earth movement. In general, a capital project is an activity that creates, improves, replaces, or maintains a fixed asset with a life expectancy of greater than 5 years. Again, this document is really a planning document. It identifies needs that are not constrained by projected funding availability so that unmet needs can be reported and prioritized for use of funds can be balanced. We bring the plan back every 2 years so that we may reprioritize our CIP document. CIP projects are prioritized based off several factors. Obviously, the availability of funds is a major driving force behind a project. Also included is annual maintenance and replacement of assets to provide cost-effective protection of our infrastructure. Computer infrastructure and systems improvement projects costing over $100,000 are also included in the CIP because their cost and complexity present planning and funding challenges similar to traditional capital projects. Projects are also prioritized based on policy directive. Various planning processes such as the circulation element, harbor master plan, or long-term water supply are examples of this. These policies are outlined on pages 5 through 12 of your document. And lastly, projects can be prioritized based off regulatory requirements or new requirements, such as mitigation measures. Included in the document are the individual CIP project pages, and I just wanted to take a moment to walk you through one of these pages to kind of give you a better understanding. Starting on the top and working our way clockwise, we have the project title and the description that describes the project's purpose. We have the department or program that's responsible for the development of that CIP project. In the middle of our page, we have specific plans or policies that are relating to the project. And on the bottom, we have costs and funding sources that have been identified for that particular project. And something new to the CIP this year is located on the bottom of your page there. That is the infrastructure category. And that is, staff has identified the type of need that the project is placing on city infrastructure. Funding sources can come from different forms. We have the general fund, which accounts for activities and services that are traditionally associated with city governments, such as parks and recreation, library, police and fire. These are financed primarily through tax-generated revenues. We have enterprise funds, which are usually generated from user fees. These would include airports, downtown parking, water, wastewater, waterfront. We have intra-city funds. These are services provided to departments by other departments. Programs such as building maintenance, fleet replacement, or information systems would be included here. And we have designated funds, such as a voter-approved tax that is designated for a specific type of project. For example, Measure A, whose funds are designated for streets projects. A strategy departments will often utilize is to try and leverage their funds to qualify for additional monies via available grants opportunities or public-private partnerships. Programs will use the city's funds for the city's share or matching funds that may be required for a grant or a public-private partnership. For some projects, it's also advantageous to spend some city funds on conceptual design so the project can be a stronger grant candidate. The table before you is the first 2 years of the CIP broken down by funding. Projects that are included here are considered budget-ready projects, or they've been identified as a critical need. Some examples of the type of projects that are listed in the first 2 years. On the funded side, we have the airport taxiway improvement, parking lot 2 staircase repair, and the Anapamu Street bridge replacement project. On the unfunded side, we have the police station replacement, 1,000 Steps renovation, and the Central Library Plaza improvement. The example listed on the bottom there is there to represent the resources are not available at this time to support our streets pavement maintenance. The graph before you reflects 6 years of projects totaling close to $695 million. Looking at the 6-year plan overall, we see that 40% is funded and approximately 60% is unfunded at this time. Now, if we were to pull those two pieces of the pie apart and look at them individually, we can look at the funding sources and the type of projects that might be included in them. On the funded side, we see that 92% of funded projects are predominantly from enterprise or designated funds. The general fund, the red piece of the pie there, only has a small portion identified, and that would be for the funding for its ongoing maintenance of existing city facilities. Some of the bigger projects or project funding sources would be the streets, airport, water, wastewater, and grants or public-private partnerships. Moving over to the unfunded projects, we see that 35% of it is made up from of general fund projects. The challenge here is that we have to balance those between other competing unfunded projects, such as Streets Capital and projects looking for grant or public-private partnership opportunities. Staying on that unfunded piece of the pie, we're going to break that up into the 3 categories that I mentioned earlier on the project page. We see that approximately 23% of those unfunded projects is for essential maintenance, and while 77% is an improvement of some kind to be made on city infrastructure. Next, I'm going to go over quickly and try and identify some of the different departments' program highlights and their funding sources. We'll start with Administrative Services, whose projects address information management systems used across the city. The City TV Master Control Room Equipment Replacement Project is funded through the Cable Public Educational and Governmental Fee, the PEG fee, you see there. This is a 1% fee charged to cable TV subscribers. Airport projects are based on needs assessments for infrastructure that is coordinated with the Federal Aviation Association. The majority of these projects are anticipated to be funded with FFA grants, with the remaining from airport enterprise funds. These projects were brought before the Airport Commission for review on October 15th. Community development CRP projects include an electronic permit plan upgrade and an update to the zoning ordinance. The zoning ordinance update is in year 2 of a 3-year project that was funded through the general fund. The permit plan upgrade will be funded by a technology fee that is collected as part of building permit fees. The creek's restoration and water quality improvement projects focus on improvements to city watersheds with the intent of improving creek and ocean water quality and restoring natural creek systems. The creek's projects are anticipated to be funded by a combination of Measure B funds and various state, federal, and private foundation grants. Since there is uncertainty associated with grant acquisition, these projects are considered unfunded for purposes of the CIP. These were brought before the Creeks Advisory Committee on October 15th. The fire department projects include the replacement of Fire Station 7 on Stanwood Drive and the renovation of the fire training facility classroom. All fire projects are currently unfunded. Library projects will be completed via a combination of funding sources, including general fund and donations that will fund the central library renovations, and ICS funding, which is designated to address deferred maintenance, such as painting and minor repairs. These were brought before the Library Board on October 28th. The city created the Interdepartmental Neighborhood Improvement Task Force to plan, organize, implement, and monitor all projects initiated to rectify long-held concerns in city neighborhoods. Common concerns here would be ADA improvements, streetlight improvements, and public infrastructure. These were reviewed on November 12th. Parks and Recreation has identified 42 projects. Parks and Rec projects range from the renovation of key recreation facilities, such as the artificial sport field development, park renovation projects, and larger projects, such as the development of a new Central City Recreation Center and Northside Recreation Center. Parks and Recreation continues to prioritize playground replacement and park infrastructure safety and proposes additional funding for the Cabrillo Pavilion and Bathhouse renovation project, the development of a new Parks and Recreation Facilities Master Plan, and implementation of the Urban Forest Management Plan. Due to the limited availability of general fund revenues for capital projects, the realization of many of these projects will be dependent on non-city funding sources, including grants and public-private partnerships. These were reviewed by the Parks and Recreation Commission on October 22nd. The Police Department building headquarters replacement has been acknowledged as a capital project for many years and was recommended for funding by the Infrastructure Financing Task Force in 2008. A new project this year is the biometric rifle locks and checkout system. All police projects are also unfunded. Public Works has several programs under them, including downtown parking, which has 9 surface lots and 5 parking structures whose ages range from 8 to 45 years old. Projects are generally repair of existing facilities and upgrades to operating systems to improve efficiency of the parking program. 2 new projects to the 6-year CIP are energy-efficient LED lighting and solar panel carports at the garages. These were reviewed by the Downtown Parking Committee on October 9th. Public Works has 2 intra-city funds, facilities and fleet. Facilities includes major maintenance, repair, and replacement projects for city-owned facilities. Fleet projects include the city's fleet replacement program and upgrades to its service area. It can be a challenge at times for the facilities program to secure funding. Funding for fleet replacement, however, is planned based on a planned life expectancy of the assets. As you're aware, the Planning Commission is charged under the circulation element to review Measure A and streets capital projects. A handout was provided yesterday for the proposed projects for fiscal year 16. These projects were reviewed by the Transportation and Circulation Committee on October 23rd and they had favorable comments on the proposed projects. I wasn't going to go into individual project detail at this time, but if you do have questions, we have staff here that can answer them for you at the end of the presentation. Maintenance of existing infrastructure and safety continue to be the primary focus of projects within the Streets Capital Fund. Priority projects include pavement maintenance, traffic signal maintenance and operational upgrades, sidewalk repair, and access ramps. Bridge replacement projects, like the Cabrillo, Coda, and Mission bridges, are a major focus in the Streets Capital Fund, as 88.53% of funding for bridges is from federal grants. Staff has identified 82 projects here, as this is a large portion of the CIP document. Wastewater capital projects include the El Estero Wastewater Treatment Plant Air Process and Biosolids project. At $42 million, these projects will be funded through a state revolving fund loan. The drought has caused the Water Capital Fund to shift project prioritization with the possible reactivation of the desal facility added to the CIP. These projects were reviewed by the Water Commission on October 13th. And last but certainly not least, we have the waterfront, whose projects include the dock replacement at Marina 1, Marina Renovations Program, which provides annual repairs to Stearns Wharf, and the replacement of a Harbor Patrol boat. The funding for these projects is proposed to come from the Harbor Preservation Fund and Division of Boating and Waterways Loans and Grants. Now, I've quickly gone over some of the department project highlights. If you need details, they are provided in the project pages located in your document. If you have questions, we have staff here.
And before we move on to questions, I just wanted to explain a little about how the capital improvement program, which really, as Brendan said, is more of a plan than a program, interacts with our 2-year budget process. The CIP, as mentioned, the general fund projects in here are currently unfunded. As part of the budget preparation, the prioritization for the general fund projects will be made, and the funded projects will be included in the city administrator's recommended budget to council. But that process has yet to happen, but it will happen based on the information in the document. As Brandon mentioned, the document is updated to reprioritize every 2 years. That is done in coordination with our 2-year budget cycle. So the two documents work very much together in that the first 2 years of the capital improvement program form the basis for the funding for the budget, although, of course, there may be things in the program that we are still unable to fund within those first 2 years that are listed as things work we would like to have accomplished in those years.
Okay, thank you. Does that conclude your report? Do we have any speaker slips, Ms. Brooke?
Yes, we do, Madam Chair. We have one.
Okay, thanks. Leslie Wiscombe from the Parks and Recs Commission.
Good afternoon again, Mr. Chair and members of the Commission.
We haven't seen you in a long time.
I'm Leslie Wiscombe. I'm chairman of the Parks and Recreation Commission, and I'm not quite ready, but I'll speak to what I can. The Commission did review the proposed capital improvement program for 2016 to 2021 for the Parks and Recreation Department. And I just wanted to go over a few of those comments. Since chipping away, for lack of a better term, at our deferred maintenance backlog is a priority, annual programs such as the Parks Infrastructure Program, Irrigation System Renovation, Park Restroom Renovation Program, and the Park Playground Replacement Program, as well as the Median and Parkway Landscape Renovation Program are all essential. And the Median and Parkway Landscape Renovation Program is also very timely, considering that we're in this drought and we can really start to convert to some water-wise gardening along our parkways and make them look make them look nice, keep our city looking good. Public safety is obviously always the number one priority. So the park infrastructure safety program, the playground replacement program, and also the 1,000 Steps renovation are extremely important, I think, to our city. And I just wanted to take a minute to comment on what we call the Parks and Recreation Master Plan. We're in a position to do that. It's an old plan that really needs to be updated, and I think if we fund that, it gives us the ability moving forward to respond to opportunities as they come up. And I think that's very essential. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was the Urban Forest Management Plan. I believe you all supported that when before it went to council, and council eventually approved it. It's really essential, I think, to keep that funding going for that. And the staff has identified a street tree master plan, which again is another timely element within the urban forest management plan as something that they'd like to see happen. And because we're in this drought, as you all know, we've lost some trees. We have opportunities in other areas where developments are going on to really provide trees. Trees provide healthy environments, and I think that it's time that we fund that also, and I hope that you will recommend funding of the street tree master plan within the urban forest management plan to keep that going. We don't want dust to settle on the management plan and just put it on the shelf. We'd like to keep moving along to implement things. And I think that's pretty much my comments. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair, I have a couple questions.
Sure. Commissioner Jordan.
Thank you. Thanks for coming today, Leslie. I appreciate it. You're, once again, the only one who showed up to lobby. Come on up here. I have a couple questions for you.
Okay.
Yep. So your categories, of course, queued up in my comments later on, but while you're here, I just want to take advantage of lobbying you a couple of questions. But and just for an example, you mentioned street trees, and we had a poor on-the-ground record of replacing street trees even before the budget impact. I was part of the group that went through the master plan, and I forget the number, but the number's a really bad number, a really high number. And I guess part of what I'd just like you to chat about a little is the uniqueness of parks, actual parkland or park functions, that when you let something go 5 years, actually the consequences to recover that might be 25 or 50 years, if you could talk to that a bit. It's not just like you have a piece of sidewalk that's cracked and it'll still be there and cracked next year, but the loss of a tree, for example, might take 25 or 50 years to recover. Could you talk a little bit to that about how that affects your particular area?
Well, if I'm understanding your question, yes. We have a Parks has a study that shows how old our trees are, and estimates of how old some of them are, and every time we lose an old one, we lose shade, we lose and we replace it with a new one that's a lot smaller. We're losing the positive environmental impacts of having a mature tree in that spot. So it's an interesting the replacement of trees, I think, from my recollection, and having been on the board of Santa Barbara Beautiful, who helps assist in this street tree program by providing trees, I think we used to replace them 1.5. Was it 1.5, Jill? Is that right? Half. 50% of them. Okay, 50%. I thought it was 1.5. But, then the drought hit, and we're not replacing any street trees at this point. It's not prudent to do so because they all require water. So,
just an example I use, but wouldn't you also say that even if you stop maintenance on a on some type of park function or facility that just started, and then you come back a couple years later, or you've cut back maintenance, that even the starting up of the funding that was there before is not sufficient because the facility has been degraded to a point where you basically have to come back and try and fix things again?
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. And when you plant trees, they need to be maintained particularly in their early years until they get established. So the maintenance part of that component is extremely important.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I think we have another question for you. Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Lodge.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, don't go away.
I didn't know I was going to be put in the hot seat.
Bring this up later, but since you're here, I'm going to bring it up now. There is some in the master plan, the CIP. There is discussion of Franceschi Park and the house, and some funding. I don't recall exactly where it is down the line in the 6 years for fixing the retaining walls and so on, and that are everything there is deteriorating. I went by yesterday, and the place is a disaster. I happened to have a chance to talk to Sue Adams from the Pearl Chase Society. They spent significant sum of money trying to make the place weather tight. There are broken windows that have plywood on the inside, but it's clear that it is not weather tight at all. It looks, I'm not sure, it may have been the angle of the light, but it looks as if the glass in the skylight is gone. And so, the rain is going in, everything's going in. And it's just crumbling in front of your eyes. They put this money in thinking that they would be able to raise the money to restore the place. Well, they were able to do a project that was house restoration, but then the city said, well, the foundation is not stable and you're going to have to redo all of that. That made it millions more, and it's not the kind of project that you can raise that kind of money for. So they are out of it in terms of that, and they are looking at its eventual demolition and taking some of the plaques and the more interesting features of the building and developing a display area with interpretive signs and so on. Has the Parks and Recreation Commission talked about this at all and about how that may go? And what I'm concerned about is that I think the city ought to be looking at money for demolition at this point, somewhere in the budget, because it really is literally crumbling.
Yeah, my recollection is we had a staff report on that a while ago, but it was quite a while ago. And I know I personally have talked to our former mayor, Marty Bloom, I think we had talked about maybe refocusing the money from the Pearl Chase Society with permission of the donors to do something as you talked about. But the reality is too that the demolition of the property, I don't know if there's asbestos issues, but the demolition of the property could be quite costly, and then so I think the money has just not been there to handle that part of it.
Right. Well, that's why I think the city should start considering putting that on the plate as something that needs to be done. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Looks like Ms. Zachary might have wanted to say something on that topic.
Chair Thompson and Commissioner Lodge, we are in the process of evaluating what the next steps should be for Franceschi House and the rest of the park in terms of site improvements, A, to continue operating it as a park, and B, what the alternatives are related to Franceschi House. I anticipate that there will be information being forwarded to council regarding decisions that need to be made to really kick that process off in the next couple of months. And the department has identified the need to get a handle on what types of improvements need to occur and how to move forward with that. So you'll be hearing about that at some point in the future.
Okay, thank you.
As a follow-up on that, has the city rolled in, or your review that you're doing right now, rolled in the liability issues that are attendant to a dilapidated house like that? You know, if somebody got in there and started a fire or something like that, it could have really serious consequences.
Chair Thompson and members of the commission, yes, all of the issues related to management and use of the park are under consideration.
Okay, thanks. Commissioner Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question for Ms. Bjork about speed hump maintenance. Is that something that is, I didn't find it referenced in the budget, but is it in there without having a specific call out? Because over time, the speed humps that are in and around school zones become less effective due to street maintenance or asphalt lifts. And so is that something that's regularly upgraded?
I can speak to that generally, and is Pat still here? Pat Kelly can speak to it more directly, but it would be included in our street maintenance, overall street maintenance, which is one of our more underfunded areas. Our current approach is to try and preserve our most critical routes of travel, and they're receiving most of our repair and maintenance money. And unfortunately, less arterial roads are being given less priority. We do prioritize traffic safety in areas around schools, so we will be frequently looking at that. And if we think that there's needed improvements there, that would be an area of priority.
Thank you. I may be looking for a motion later or support from fellow commissioners to just maybe include something in the safe routes to school line item or another appropriate category to upgrade speed humps, in particular around Peabody School and the other school that's out there, El Montecito, in that neighborhood without sidewalks.
Okay, Commissioner Peugeot.
Thank you. I have some questions, actually, and I categorize them in 3 different ways. I have one just general approach to the CIP, just one question of those. And then the bulk of my other questions are either just a few status reports and then some focus questions, all in the streets and transportation section.
Yeah,
so,
we'll go ahead and ask your questions now.
Okay,
Now's
great.
the time to do it.
Okay. So my overall question is this. On page 4, the staff report, and this is for Ms. Bjork, I think, there's a section called project prioritization. And I would like to know how those priorities work as you basically translate those priorities into the different portions of the 6-year capital improvement program. Are these all these items, are these the only ones that are in the CIP? Are these the ones that tend to get the 2015-16 funding? How do you sort that out?
Generally, our projects are a big part of project prioritization really comes back to funding. And so that's sort of the baseline of our project prioritization is how much can we fund. Then once we get the funding element identified, I think that you heard Commissioner Jordan speak to the issue of deferred maintenance really increases overall life cycle cost. So we look for trying to use our resources in a way that will keep costs as low as possible. So doing maintenance in a timely manner, when we can afford to, will reduce the ultimate cost to the city for maintenance of that piece of infrastructure. So that's another important part of how we prioritize our maintenance. If we know something will cost $1 to repair today and $10 to repair next year, we'll try and get it done today if at all possible. These other elements of the plans and the neighborhood requests all come in. They are considerations. I don't think there's a 1, 2, 3, 4. There are elements that come in to help us inform how projects are prioritized. Certainly, if we have 2 projects within a neighborhood, one of which is strongly supported by the neighborhood and the other is not, the strongly supported one will be the one that gets more prioritization. So there are elements of the prioritization that's not a strict rule of numbering or anything like that.
So if I could rephrase for myself, so basically the first key priority is there funding and is there a life cycle issue with maintenance and replacement needs and things like that. But then secondarily, those items, say, that are bulleted more or less on page 4, those are key factors that then you start incorporating into the decisions on what the shape of the actual project is, something like that?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. So, like I said, the bulk of my questions and comments are in the Public Works, Streets, Transportation section. So the section starts out with kind of an overall line item list, and there's a few status reports or just maybe a 15-second update on some of those that I would appreciate just for my education. The first one I have a question on is the status of bicycle facilities, Las Positas, and MODOC multi-use path.
I'm happy to answer that one because that's a really good news story. The city staff applied for a grant from it's an active transportation program grant, and we were successful in receiving I want to say 1.9, but I'm not sure, a substantial amount of money to do the planning and environmental design review for that project. So that project is included in the CIP as a funded project, I believe, for next fiscal year, and it's a project that we're beginning it this fiscal year. We're taking the contract to council for award in a couple of weeks. So that's a project that is moving forward, at least in the design phase. The project funding for construction is not secured. The fact that we were successful in securing the preliminary funding is a good indicator that it's an attractive project, and we will continue to seek grant funding for that project.
Great. That sounds pretty exciting. The next one. The next one, actually a group of them on page 3. Well, is it page 3? No, I think it's section 3. I don't know if these are page numbered. First, second, it is the third page, though. There's a whole list of items that all say corridor improvements and then different types of improvements. So basically, I have questions on a few of those. First of all, what qualifies as a corridor in order to become part of this category? I'm not quite sure. Is it always the largest streets, certain streets of certain quality or need? And then within that, I'd like just a little information on what the scope of the project is for the access to Cottage Hospital corridor improvement.
And I'm going to have Jessica Grant, who's our transportation planner, respond to those.
And you might as well stay up there, Ms. Grant, because I think we'll probably I'll be having more questions that probably would be referred to you.
Sure. Mr. Chair and Commissioner Peugeot, for your first question for corridor improvements, what consists of a corridor improvement? And typically, if we're doing more than one intersection, looking at several blocks is a kind of a general rule of thumb when we call it a corridor improvement versus an intersection project. As far as the access to Cottage Hospital, that one is currently on hold due to funding issues. As far as the scope, we were looking at changing the portion of Cry-Riel that was changed by Caltrans in the 80s from it used to be a two-way, then it was changed to a one-way. The goal of this project would be to change that back into a two-way configuration. To do that would involve changes to the freeway off-ramps in that location. And like I said, currently on hold for funding.
A follow-up question on that. First of all, I was hoping that that's what it referred to, because I think that's a much-needed change. I've been following and participating in some of those discussions going way, way back before the new Cottage Hospital was approved. But when you say on hold, what do you mean? You mean you haven't obtained the funding, or you thought you had funding and had to push it back a number of years? Or
We initially did have some funding from Cottage Hospital. It was one of their mitigations to involve just looking to address what some of the transportation circulation issues were. So there was a circulation options report that was reviewed by Planning Commission probably, I want to say about 5 years ago, and eventually approved by City Council. And the next phase would go to a project study report. We need that report completed before we could then solicit some grant funding for the project.
And right now you don't have the funding for the project study report?
Correct.
Okay. But that's not $4 million. The project study report, right? Because the first number you have showing up in that one is in the 2019, 2020.
It would be a portion of that.
I see. You would do it all within a year's period.
Yes, part of that.
I see. Okay.
Part of that $4 million would include all the environmental review documents designed to a certain level.
Big project.
Yes. So I think we had ballparked probably about $3 million of that needed for the next phase.
My next question is on the next page, and it's, I think, just a pretty quick question. Down towards the bottom, you have under, it's called maintenance, historic sandstone retaining walls study, and I think there's another reference on the next page to maintenance, street, concrete, and sandstone, curb and gutter. My interest there being on the sandstone part. So when you work on both of those, one is the study, I think, and another is the maintenance of areas that have those sandstone. Do you retain them and replace them, or do you remove them? Is there an effort made to keep as many of those as possible?
Pat Kelly, I'm city engineer. And the focus of that is just simply really to identify a need rather than an action plan. We just know that there's a significant number of these walls, many of them historic, and we don't really have the funding to really do anything with them. And so it's part of identifying that this is part of the city's infrastructure that needs to be considered, but we don't have any funding for it. So we haven't come up with an action plan.
Does it include the sandstone curbs as well as the walls?
No. The
that
sandstone curbs is just really part of the roadway infrastructure, and we address that case by case as we do major projects.
And that's the one on the next page that says maintenance. So when you encounter one of those, do you do what you can to retain the actual sandstone, or do you take it out and replace it with concrete?
Case by case. We try to maintain it as much as possible in place.
You do?
Yes. They're difficult to remove and maintain their integrity, so we try our best to always leave them in place. And then in some cases on some of our major projects where they're just spotted around and they've major uplift, for example, on Coda, you may right across from the farmer's market, you'll see that there's some major sandstone curb structures, essentially, that have lifted up. Those, on a case-by-case, we may be able to remove and replace them. In other cases, we may have to just remove them, store them for special cases, and then many times what we replace them with is like faux sandstone. That has been successful, too, in some places.
Strongly encourage you to protect as many of those and replace them back in the same style as possible.
But then again, just, that's very expensive. And if you have a limited zero-sum game of maximizing your maintenance, it's a tough judgment to make many times.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But yes.
Yeah, nonetheless.
Yes.
Then my next question has to do with... Let's see. No, actually, I think I can skip that one. My last one has to do with, and maybe this is you, Mr. Kelly, after all, traffic signal maintenance. It's the very last one on that line item sheet before the individual project pages start. Traffic signal maintenance program. It looks like you spend a certain allotted amount every year over time. How do you prioritize those? And is it basically minor updates, or is it actually replacement as well?
Combination of both. The focus is improve traffic safety. Our traffic engineer, Derek Bailey, has been very successful in what Brandon indicated earlier about leveraging limited funds. As a matter of fact, he was able to get $1 million highway safety improvement program project that is in design right now to improve traffic safety signaling or facilities for larger red lights, green lights, and designations, et cetera, throughout the city. So he's very good at leveraging. We give it a priority within the limited amount of money that we have to move towards improving traffic safety, vehicular and pedestrian and bicycle throughout the city. That's his focus.
As may have been noticed before, I have a concern with streetscape design overall in the city. And rather than this piecemeal fashion, I don't know if the signalization and other street furniture, let's say, is subject to the urban design guidelines or not in the downtown area. But one of the things that I would like to see at some point addressed is some sort of streetscape guidelines for use in determining what type, style, scale of these kind of improvements that we install or replace. When we replace old ones. So that's an interest of mine that I would like pursued in some fashion. I'm not sure the best way to do it, so that's why I bring it up.
Just real quick, is that every effort is made to put the replacement computers, et cetera, within the existing boxes, so we don't make it any creaser.
That's truly maintenance.
Any larger, but then some of the newer technologies and demands of expectations is have battery backups, and the battery backups are pretty tough not to be larger than the existing. So these are, focus on safety, and it's really tough to make them small.
And what's something I enjoy some extended conversation about.
Yes. Well, please feel free to call myself and Derek as to any ideas that we can do to do a better job.
Okay. Thank you. So now some of my specific streets and transportation items, and these are the single pages. So the first one, actually, we got a twofer here because there's two different sheets, both of which seem to relate to the Mission Canyon Road multimodal path. The first one is a bridge project, which gets some basically seed money in 2016-17, and then looks like starts to really take off the year after that. And then the other one that occurs later down on your list, I think it's called Pedestrian Enhancements, Mission Canyon Corridor. First of all, do those tie in and relate to the overall are they in sync with the concept plan that we've been discussing along Mission Canyon Road, and how do you see it working in with that overall planning process?
Yes, they are in sync. You're probably familiar with the joint city-county Caltrans funded grant that's just wrapped up. That was a joint city-county planning commission meeting that is coming to both the City Council and the County Board in the near future to support moving forward with what had previously been called the Safe Passage Project, now is Mission Canyon Corridor Mission Canyon Trail Pedestrian Improvements.
Multimodal.
Multimodal, yes, indeed. And so that was the initial planning process, support to moving on to hopefully get grant funding to do the next step, namely design and environmental. Now, that is one of the items that is mentioned in the 6-year CIP that is described. Now, in the same site is the Mission Creek Bridge at Los Olivos, Mission Canyon Road, as you go from the city to the county. That is a part of our Highway Bridge Replacement and Rehabilitation Program, HBRR, our Highway Bridge Program. And an example of other bridges in that program have been the currently under construction Cabrillo and Mason Street, et cetera, projects. As part of that whole overarching program, includes not just structural deficiencies, as the Cabrillo project was, but also design deficiencies. And so this bridge, built in 1892, I recall, is really very good structural shape. It's just good old, like a Roman type bridge, just simple, good construction. So structurally, it's in good shape, but it's in a windy part of the road. The width of the road is one of its design deficiencies. Another deficiency is the approach speed. So that was funded as part of this Highway Bridge program, and we're looking at ways to eliminate those deficiencies in coordination and collaboration with the recently completed Caltrans grant, planning grant. So it should be very interesting. It should be, I'm optimistic that we can come up with a plan that can significantly reduce the cost of the pedestrian passage, but won't be able to create the pedestrian passage, but can be done in collaboration to reduce the cost of that larger project.
Great. So I imagine that'll be a fairly public process when you develop the plans for that, because there'll be communication with both city and county and with the Safe Passage group, whatever their new name is, as you develop those engineering plans for that.
Oh, yes. The plan is set, approved by the boards as the policy of both the city and the county. So any other subsequent capital project would have to be, in compliance with that.
Okay. And hopefully you'll have an outreach program for that so that they're involved. Okay, great. Next one. Cliff Drive traffic safety. Looks like there's $900,000 allocated in 2016-17, and the source is grant funding. My question there is, being that has also been one of the key projects in the city overall, is that the earliest that you can apply for those funds, or is there any chance that there might be some ability to actually apply and get any portions of that funding sooner?
The timing there reflects our best effort to move forward as promptly as the process allows us. For example, just recently we became aware that this project could be funded by a HSIP or Highway Safety Improvement Program grant. Got support from council to move forward with doing a public outreach to find out which option of many should be followed through with. And so our traffic engineer, in collaboration with our transportation planning division, had an outreach meeting at the Monroe School to find out community interests after significant canvassing and even an online surveys, find out what improvements should be the priority there. That information has just come in, and now we're looking forward to moving forward with the application of a grant that takes a certain amount of time to see if it is eligible. Caltrans, FHWA needs to approve that, and then once that's done, then we move forward with soliciting proposals to do the design, and follow through with construction after we get the anticipated construction approval. So one step at a time. I think everybody is anxious to move forward with it promptly, but this is the process that we have when we're leveraging our funds.
Okay. So even though nothing shows up in 2015, 16 or so, you're still actively pursuing funding on the shortest time frame you think you can.
Yes.
Apparently, that's what it sounds like. Great. Okay. The next cluster of items here. So maybe I'll just kind of point them out all at once. There's a page, they're alphabetical, I believe, so it's called Intersection Improvements, Alomar at State. And then, in my view, related is one later on that relates to pedestrian enhancement, safe routes to school. And then later on, pedestrian enhancements, let's see, I guess school zone safety, some such title as that. Kind of thinking of those three kind of all together, and also kind of in listening to Commissioner Higgins' comments earlier about the speed bumps around the Peabody School, I would like to see some sort of discussion started about the safe routes to school around Peabody School, including the Alomar intersection, and speed humps, because I hope I'm not guilty, but I do travel those roads an awful lot, and there's a temptation to speed, I agree, but hopefully, usually when I drive around in my little tiny gem car, I can't really go fast enough to even try. But I think that it is time to take a look at that particular area. I don't know if it's half the district, but a substantial portion of that school district is on the east side of State Street, on the west side of State Street, not only on the east. And crossing Alomar is a major, probably the major impediment of children being able to actually walk to school, even if they're only a few blocks away just off of State. And it's been an issue for a long, long time. And unfortunately, I don't think it's part of the Upper State Street guidelines, so it hasn't gotten any attention, I don't think, on that corridor, because that starts at Las Positas. And the downtown grid area, and it is covered by urban design guidelines, let's say, and this is a unattended to section. And so I would like to see some combination of funded project through State's Routes to School, neighborhood mobility, school safety zone, that would pull together those elements to improve the walkability of the area. And I think a side benefit of that is I know there are a lot of pedestrians outside of the school children as well that use that intersection. And it's one of, I think, the longest intersections to traverse in the city. So that's a main comment of mine today. And then, and we can get back to that later. But my next question has to do with all the projects related to the east side, the lower Milpa Street improvements, just the status of those. How far away are we from really substantially completing those, and which components, major components, are left to be done? There's several, I think, individual sheets that relate to that.
I believe Jessica is the one to answer that question.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Peugeot, with respect, I was the project manager for the East Side Neighborhood Transportation Management Plan, and I'm happy to say that a lot has been implemented to date with the East Side effort. We just completed the Safe Routes to Cleveland School project, which was intersection improvements at Salinas and Cassique that just came in. Over the summer, we also installed some pedestrian refuge islands right in the vicinity of Franklin Elementary School in Adelante. We are also currently working with Edison on retrofitting all of the east side lighting, street lighting, to LED. and that's broken into 4 phases. We have the first 2 phases complete, which is right near, again, Franklin and Adelante. We're working on installing the phase 3, which is in the vicinity closest to the freeway near Punta Gorda Bridge. And following phase 4 is just north of the school for a few blocks, kind of in between junior high and the elementary schools. So we also will be installing some access ramps along Voluntario in the next 2 months. And we also were lucky to receive 3 of our active transportation program grants that Ms. Bjork had mentioned about Las Positas, but 3 of them are on the east side. So we'll be awarding contracts soon for design for the replacement of Montecito-Yananali Bridge, and the sole purpose of replacement is to add a pedestrian facility. That bridge is used by families both going to Franklin and Adelante schools and to Cleveland Elementary School. We also have a grant, the ATP, for replacement of the dilapidated bridge along Cacique over Sycamore Creek, and we'll be putting in a new pedestrian bicycle bridge at that location. And we will also be putting in a new one at that same intersection to Soledad. And so the boundaries, again, for the schools, it would serve both Cleveland as a safe routes to school corridor for that and to Franklin. So extremely elated to move forward on those. And the last one, it was just outside of the boundary area, but we did receive a lot of comment, and we will be installing new sidewalk along Milpas and Calle Puerto Vallarta, which is en route to Dwight Murphy. And again, that whole area there, the students go to Cleveland Elementary, and there isn't any buses that pick up in that area, so families are walking that corridor every day, and we'll be putting sidewalk there. So a lot of movement in the east side, I'm happy to report.
A major accomplishment for the city, and also I'd like to recognize you for your hard work in it, because I know you've been at it and pulling it together for a long time and finding all the pieces of the puzzle to fit together into one unified plan that really serves that area and will for a long, long time. So I think that's really fantastic.
Thank you. And there is still unidentified needs right now that are reflected in our capital program.
I have one last question, and it's not transportation. It has to do with the water conservation program funding. I was noticing, and that's the funding that I'm assuming includes the audits that the water agency comes and can audit your property and provide some rebates for installing drought tolerant and all sorts of other things, I suppose. I was just noticing on it, though, that although there is funding for 2015-16, I don't see funding subsequent to that.
Commissioner Peugeot, that program that you're referring to is actually funded out of our operating budget, so you're not looking at that here. What you are looking at under water conservation is a project that we are at the very preliminary stages of looking at changing the manner in which we meter water so that we can have more immediate response to use, and it has real water conservation opportunities in that we can give real-time notification to customers of leaks, but it also gives us good understanding what's going on within the distribution system and gives us water conservation opportunities there as well. So that's why you're seeing that funding listed in that manner.
And that's just a 1-year duration and it's done, or?
That's really looking at the preliminary design, doing an assessment of whether it's feasible or not. And if it is feasible, then we would need to seek funding and we would be programming it, but it will probably be an update to the CIP. But at this point in time, since we haven't determined feasibility, it hasn't been programmed.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Well, those are my questions, and there's at least a couple of items that I'll come back to in my comments. Thanks.
Thank you. Commissioner Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Did you want us to bundle quick comments along with questions, or just questions for now?
Well, you could put in your comments. A lot of the questions seem to have evolved into comments. So if you want to include comments now or you want to reserve them, we will have a comment period at the end.
Okay, I'll go through my questions. I think they're pretty streamlined. First, on page 9 of our package regarding Infrastructure Financing Task Force report, Ms. Bjork, would it be possible for the Planning Commission to receive a copy of the Council's subcommittee report that's going to be given to the full Council on January 27th? I think then I probably will hold off on my questions, because I did attend one of those public forums that Mayor Schneider and Councilmember White-and-Rouse facilitated.
Commissioner Schwartz, I'm sure it will be possible to provide you with the Council Agenda report. The primary action on the 27th will be that subcommittee reporting out.
Okay.
So we're expecting to hear from the Council subcommittee themselves rather than a staff report, although there is some summary information from the staff, and we can certainly provide that. I will make sure that that is communicated.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think that'd be helpful. Then I have a question. This is now on page 10 of our packet. This is under the Clean Water Act. I'm wondering when exactly this annual report will be submitted to the Regional Water Quality Board, and perhaps Mr. Jordan already knows the answer to that, but I'll ask staff since he sits on that board.
I'm sorry, and can you tell me which...
This is under the Clean Water Act. The last sentence says, the Creeks Division collects quarterly reports from city staff and compiles the SWMP's annual report for submittal to the Regional Water Quality Control Board, and I'm wondering when this year, since it's annually, when that gets submitted. I would like a copy of that. I'm just wondering what the process is for the timing and the process for that submittal to Regional Water Quality Board.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Schwartz, the report is completed at the end of the calendar year, and we'd be happy to
so December
check
of
with
this year.
Creeks Division staff and determine what would be the best way to forward that to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Then it would be helpful for me to just have a quick improved understanding. I think on page 22 of the program, under bicycle transportation account, it's referred to as BTA. I'm wondering, BTP, well, BTA, BTP. I'm wondering how this differs from, or how it relates to the bicycle master plan. Could somebody clarify that? This is under grants, bicycle transportation account. Talks about the funds for improvement of safety and convenience, bicycle commuters. Just wondering how that dovetails with our master plan.
Our master plan, our planning documents are one of the ways that we are able to establish our priorities and our planning documents for the community, and they are very helpful to us in moving forward to secure grants. The bicycle transportation account appears to be, and I'm not familiar with it, a grant funding source. So the development of the bicycle master plan the update of the bicycle master plan will increase our opportunities to apply for and secure funding.
It's like a policy substantiation in a sense in applying for grants that help us further implementation of our bicycle master plan. Is that a correct way to characterize it, Ms. Grant?
Most of the funds through the BTA are for the smaller kind of just do-it items. So if somebody requests for hitching posts in the right-of-way, or maybe for bicycle corrals, kind of the low-level hanging items.
Speaking of the bicycle corral, I was just in that neighborhood for a function yesterday evening. How are we doing with the bicycle corral, since I know it was a one-year pilot project?
Yes, it continues to be a one-year pilot, but to date it's been very successful. I know that times when I walk by it during probably the lunch hour, it always seems to be really well used.
This is the 100 block of East Cannon Perdido,
yes,
right in front of
Handlebar
and some of those other.
And we've had more requests since then for some more bicycle corrals.
Great, okay. Then we go to the Goleta Slough Mouth Management Program, and I'm just wondering, I thought John Ledbetter had been the point person on that from our planning staff, was wondering who else is now on that task force. And secondly, will a report be produced when finalized in May? There's a statement here, project formulation, biological assessment underway, expected to be finalized May of 2015.
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Schwartz, Andrew Bermond from the Airport Department. This is a project that's of high importance to the Airport Department because it identifies a resolution to a bird wildlife strike hazard potential at the airport. When the slough mouth is closed for prolonged periods of time, the water level in the slough tends to rise, and we attract large migratory waterfowl, ducks and geese primarily, which are the high hazard birds for aviation. This project that we're doing at the moment is design and field surveys to identify what endangered species would be impacted by a restoration of slough mouth management, and to come up with a project description that would minimize adverse environmental impacts while still being able to mitigate the wildlife strike hazard. And we anticipate that will be complete in summer or spring.
And could the Planning Commission get a copy of that finalized report when it's done? Could you have that forwarded through Renee? Okay.
Yeah, that will be presented both to the Airport Commission. We can bring that to Planning Commission as well.
Okay. And is this effort, I'm trying to recall, is this effort one that's kind of the multi-agency, multi-jurisdictional coalition effort, or is that the separate sea level rise vulnerability project that I might be thinking of?
You may be thinking of that. The Goleta Slough Management Committee is the interagency group that brings the airport, county, city of Goleta, UCSB, a number of other regulatory agencies together to discuss the Goleta Slough holistically. And there's a grant that the city is managing to update the Goleta Slough ecosystem management plan. This is perhaps an implementation item of that plan.
I've said before, so I will fold in one comment, how impressed I am. I've talked with you at length about some of these activities, and our airport is such a unique property and so uniquely situated with the sensitive eco-habitat next to the ocean. When we look at all of the other airports in California, you've remarked to me sort of what a complex set of considerations and planning efforts need to take place regarding our airport. And so I just want to acknowledge you, and if Ms. Johns is still here, but our airport director, for fantastic work you do. Okay, moving on. Right in the next page, Hollister drainage improvement. I'm just curious, this jumped out at me. I'm wondering why this project seems to start in 2018, 2019, when this also seems to be one of the higher environmentally sensitive projects, this eco channel that's referenced here. Is that something, Mr. Bermond, you could comment on?
Certainly. One of the biggest constraints that we have, and I think you'll hear this from just about every department, is funding. And the highest priority projects are the ones where we can leverage local dollars to apply for airport improvement program grants with the FAA. This is not eligible under any federal program, so it's a later year project.
Okay, that certainly explains that. It's all about balancing the funds. We know that. Okay, moving on to Neighborhood Improvement Task Force. This is a matrix. There's a number 1 at the top of the page. I don't know if that helps. Neighborhood Improvement Task Force. So I'm just curious. I've circled 2 items here, and I was wondering why they've been categorized as non-essential improvements. One of them is bus shelters for low and moderate income neighborhoods. That's considered an enhancement. And the check mark was under non-essential improvements. And the other one on this page also categorizes non-essential. Lower West Side / West Side street light improvement. And I'm just thinking, for those whose primary mode of transportation for those residents in those neighborhoods, there's a safety issue, crime-related issue when we don't have the proper lighting. And So maybe you could comment on that, Ms. Grant.
Yes. Chair Thompson and Commissioner Schwartz, I'm also serve on the Neighborhood Improvement Task Force team. I do have to say, for the infrastructure category, even we boiled it down to those 3 sections that Mr. Bodette had said, and staff did really struggle with trying to put these various projects in a category, and we kind of looked at it as a way of would this improvement, if we didn't have it, would it cause a complete shutdown of the city not having it there?
Mm-hmm.
So that's how we sort of...
A matter of degrees,
thought,
right?
Yeah, it is at degrees. So it definitely is a
Okay.
very subjective category. So we considered it more of an enhancement. But
Or lesser importance as
but-
opposed to non-essential.
Right.
Yeah,
But as you
okay.
mentioned, it is very important, and especially in our low-income neighborhoods when walking and transit are the primary modes, it becomes essential, and that's why these projects are part of the program under the Neighborhood Improvement
On the other
Task
side of the
Force.
ledger, I just want to compliment you saying where I do agree on this page, under essential improvements, the ADA improvement access ramps for low and moderate income neighborhoods. That's number 1. Number 2, ADA improvements, sidewalk infill in low and moderate income neighborhoods. And lastly, so my third area where I'm complimentary is the park/facility safety improvements. Well, I guess you've lumped together. No, that's right. It's separate from the item above, Union Pacific Railroad. So safety, park facility safety improvements. So I'm very glad to see that those are high priority. Thank you so much. Now I go on to the Andre Clark Bird Refuge water quality and habitat restoration. This is under the Parks and Rec section. Correct me if my memory is off here. I thought that the council, I'm thinking at least a couple, if not 3 years ago, declined to allocate Measure B funds to remedy this, I know there's a technical term for it, I'm going to say stagnation of water, which results in the pluming and everything that follows that. Can you remind me, Ms. Zachary, what's going on there with Measure B? Because it figures prominently in this chart as being an important funding source.
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Schwartz, the project that you referenced had to do with maintenance work that we were doing at the Bird Refuge to address vegetation that had filled the concrete culverts and that had also had expanded to the point where it was creating almost a bridge to one of the islands that we have, as well as around storm drain inlets and causing a mosquito problem. The project also intended to improve water flow within the bird refuge with the idea that that would contribute to improved water quality. That project was a Parks Division and is a Parks Division project, and we got a coastal development permit. We had to remove wetland vegetation, which we then needed to do subsequent restoration. This project is much more of the long-term, how do we develop a long-term management and maintenance approach to the bird refuge that better balances the ecology of the area as well as the quality of the water and how it interfaces with the urban uses surrounding the park. And therefore, it's much more focused on water quality management from a water quality standpoint and habitat management from sort of a creeks and estuary standpoint. And therefore, it is a Measure B project rather than just a straight vegetation maintenance project.
Seems a little bit of a nuanced differentiation to me, but that was for the council to decide, so I'll let that be. So next is Cabrillo Pavilion and Bathhouse renovation. And I know from having spoken briefly with Nancy Rapp some time ago about the challenges in fundraising for all the renovations that we need there. How are we doing in terms of the mix of private fundraising versus our public sources, both inside the city and then grants? Because I don't see private funding sources referenced anywhere in the funding matrix. But I was recalling that that's going to be an absolute necessity to complete all of our funding needs there.
Chair Thompson and Commissioner Schwartz, the page on the Cabrera Pavilion and Bathhouse has a line that says grant. And I think sometimes that becomes the catch-all for non-city source of funding, whether it's general fund or former RDA funds or other sorts of funds. We are showing what we anticipate to be the remaining funding needed for the project to be soliciting outside sources of up to $1.5 million.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's very helpful. I wouldn't have assumed that private source funding would be part of the grant line item, so that's very helpful there. Okay, I see we have someone from our police department here in the audience, so my next item is the new police department headquarters building. And, of course, this has been on the books for now quite some years. And I remember back in, I think it was 2011, when we still had some RDA, we had some hope of getting some RDA funding. We were looking at trying to cobble together the funds and so forth. I'm so concerned about the steady deterioration of this building and the health jeopardy to our police force. Can you speak to, I don't know if anybody can speak to how we're going to find our way through to this escalating dollar figure that we need to construct a new police headquarters? Thank you for being here.
Yes, my name is Captain Gil Torres from the police department. Chair Thompson, Commissioner Schwartz. Yeah, the price tag for that building is quite high. I think last estimated was $54 million. And we had some redevelopment money set aside at one time that ended up going away. So there was a discussion regarding possible bond measure for this, and that the state of the economy really didn't, kind of dictate going that direction at the time. So I'm not sure where the funding is going to come from a project of this magnitude. In the meantime, we're working closely with Public Works to make some kind of some general improvements to some of our HVAC system and just kind of make it livable. Mm-hmm. We're having a gate project for security, so we're trying to make the best of what we have right now, and let's hope that something comes along in the future as far as addressing some of the needs that we have with the building.
Are there no, and I see we only have a general fund source here. Are there no grant monies in terms of public safety, law enforcement, anything? I mean, it seems like we get materials, equipment.
Right, equipment, training, stuff. But yeah, we haven't identified or
not brick and mortar improvements. And
yes,
so
nothing that we're aware of. We've been searching for that. Yes.
Yeah.
The gates that are being replaced are grant funded, but we have been keeping our eyes peeled for grant funding for the larger project, and certainly haven't come across anything. Jim Dewey's here, and he can, if you're interested, speak to some of the issues about how we're trying to maintain the existing building, which is very challenging. And of course, it's putting money into a facility that we know needs to be replaced. So it's really using scarce resources just to keep something going, where we would be better served to be able to replace the facility. But we certainly are trying to make it as usable as possible. And the funding for those types of modifications are being managed through the facilities budget. And so that's a part of that planned program work.
Well, the commission had a personal tour of the whole facility back in 2011. I participated in that, and that was certainly an up-close and kind of shock and awe experience of what, behind that facade, what's actually going on with the infrastructure. I don't necessarily want to take up time today, with additional questions. I am glad to see this is on our radar. I am dismayed about how we are going to replace it. And speak of deferred maintenance, this just gets costlier and costlier, and it's one of our it's public safety. It's one of our most critical needs and our responsibility as a city. So anyway, my hat's off to everybody who's trying to work on this and crack the nut, so to speak.
Thank you.
Thank you. Those are my questions. I'm sorry, one last one I wrote on a different piece of paper. I could not identify, so maybe you can help me find in our packet, where the Castillo Street Underpass Infrastructure Improvement Project would be. And let me say, as you're going to that section, I continue on a regular basis to hear from the public about their concerns and really questions that I can't answer, which is from an engineering perspective, why can we not fix the Castillo underpass, and I know it's Army Corps of Engineer issue and so forth, but I think each time our capital improvement project comes before us, and I've been on the Planning Commission, I say it's a matter of time when those ruts get so bad that I think we're going to have a major bumper-to-bumper accident under there. And so what can we do about it, Mr. Kelly? This is my last question. You're here to save the day.
Oh, my goodness. Chair Thompson, Commissioner Schwartz, is that is a Caltrans facility.
Soup to nuts, it's just theirs, it's their asset,
Exactly.
like Cliff Drive used to be. So,
Yes.
yeah. Any influence? Do we have any influence in trying to, was it also Army Corps of engineered asset in conjunction with Caltrans? Because I thought that I was told that some years ago when we were reviewing CIP again at that time.
Some years ago, and it's been some years, is that the Caltrans was able to get some technology from the federal government to try to have a system to disperse the water, but it didn't work. And so now they're back to where they are now planning to go back and put the pavers in, until which time they can come up with a bigger plan. Still, the state system is still is significantly underfunded still. So they don't have sufficient funds to maintain their infrastructure either. So this is a real challenge for them because what is the state need compared to all the other state needs that they have? And so this is how it's been explained to us, is that when they look at all the state needs for capacity and safety throughout the entire state, and the significant, relative to the significant cost and inconvenience of reconstructing this, this is a low priority.
So if the public wants to advocate for some improvement, do they contact SBCAG? How do they do that? Is it through SBCAG?
Every which way. Every which way you can.
I've been asked, what the right vehicle is, and they didn't know if it was the city, for example, Ms. Bjork, or outside the city.
Believe me, engineering, transportation planning, the mayor's office, we all have make every opportunity to talk to the line staff and to the management staff at Caltrans regarding this project. However, that's local and even statewide, is that it's a significant issue for them. It's a big issue, and every which way you can talk to the legislative representatives, the governor, everybody.
We'll send it up the flagpole. That's what we'll do. Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Okay, I think what I can make my comment right now, Mr. Chair, because it's very simple. First of all, I want to extend my profound appreciation to all of the city departments. This is a remarkable document, and for anybody in the city or outside the city who thinks that a city's job is simple, or that it's easy to prioritize the myriad needs that a community has, I think this document is the testament to the far-ranging needs of a city, the difficulty in balancing given financial constraints, given our general plan and all the principles in our general plan that we try to both incorporate and balance and fund. There's always more work to do, and we can refine and improve, but my hat is off to all of the city staff. I'm sure it also went through the city attorney's office, so kudos also to the city attorney's office as well. Significant undertaking, and thank you so much for everything you do. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Commissioner Campanella.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Bjork, question on the categories, which I think are quite clear on the infrastructure category between essential maintenance, essential improvements, and non-essential improvements by category. Within the essential category, I presume that various departmental budgets are addressing, the capital budgets are addressing health and safety issues.
Chair Thompson, Commissioner Campanella, to the extent that we can do so, certainly, and those are very high priority. Health and safety is our highest priority generally.
So let's say when it comes time to look at the unfunded projects of each budget, the functional plans that a certain department would have, if it involves health and safety, that may filter to the top when the City Council considers allocation of general funds. Would that be true?
Generally, that is a part of the staff's recommendation. We prioritize health and safety.
Question on the police station, which is essential item. It's shown starting in the next fiscal year, 15 to 16, I think, some funding, and then 16 through 17 fiscal years, the balance. Is that a likely period? Is that a goal or a likely period where that can happen? Or
not on that page currently.
Right.
It's unfunded, though, isn't it? Yeah, that's when we would like to do it. That's when we believe the need is, but we do not have a funding source identified. So that part of the challenge here is that we really want to be able to present both the need and when we think that need is. Sometimes we can project out and say, oh, that asset will last until 2020, and we then need to be planning to replace it. Well, we know that the police station is past when we needed to be able to replace it, but it doesn't address the issue that the money allocated there is what we'd like to do, but we haven't got a funding allocation.
Yeah. So being essential really earmarks it where you would like to do it.
I think I would differentiate essential. As was explained, this is our first year using these, so I expect we'll get more feedback on it and a better understanding. But to me, the difference between an essential improvement is the failing to do it will result in some continued adverse effect. So it will continue to be more expensive. It will not serve its primary needs as well as it needs to, versus a non-essential improvement, which is you can still get by with what it is. It would be nice to have that improvement. It would make it better, but you can go on with things more or less at the status quo without making those improvements. I think that is how I would come down to the difference between the essential and non-essential.
Okay, well, that's good. And then every department would be thinking about it the same way with that type of consistency.
Well, and as I said, we will, and I think you may see us tweak this in future years. What we're trying to do is give some categorization to help understand, because certainly non-essential improvements can be very important too. They can be right up there for health and safety reasons. We may be able to get by with the non-essential improvement, but it may offer a health and safety advantage that bumps it up even though we've classified it as non-essential.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you for that explanation. You had mentioned public-private partnerships, and Commissioner Schwartz had spoken about charitable contributions, I think, as being part of the public. Are there other things that you're thinking about that could help in the financing or acquisition of the capital items that the private sector would contribute to?
We have had, it's a challenging area for local government, opportunities for public-private partnerships. In other communities, you'll see naming opportunities. We don't tend to follow those in Santa Barbara. We have had some public-private partnerships, particularly with regard to our energy sector, where we've worked with private partnerships where they provide the capital funding for solar panels or for our cogeneration facility at the wastewater plant, and then we participate on an ongoing basis in how their revenues are shared. So those are opportunities. We do try and stay abreast of other opportunities for partnerships. We certainly have some good grant or foundations that support essential community assets like the library and our Parks Foundation. So those are not so much a public-private partnership, but certainly the public participating in the private public participating with the city public in a very helpful way. But we are one of the things that has been an area of concern from the community is, are there opportunities to improve that? And so that's certainly one of the things that we're looking for.
It'll be great to see the presentation of what the suggestions were for funding the infrastructure at City Council. And I was looking potentially at some of the larger sites, let's say, that you're looking at potentially for recreation centers, either up at the Reserve Center and other uses like where that might be an opportunity for some other use in the private sector to co-develop or something like that, where the infrastructure can be provided and help along with the cost of those. We're not detracting from the main intent, so to speak, but maybe adding something to the financing and the feasibility. On the airport, the industrial park, that's 6100 Hollister Avenue. Okay, thank you. My question is, the dollars that are shown, which appear to be generated from direct relief, the sale of property direct relief, that'll go into improving the site and developing 6 buildings of 10,000 square feet each, light industrial, as per the description. Those could be leased to the public, for-profit, or any other use. There's no restriction on what they would be used for, and generating funds or not for the airport.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Campanella, they would be restricted by zoning. Certain uses would be permissible, but yes, it would be leased by the city to a light industrial or commercial tenant.
So at some point, you may not need it now, but at some point, if it could be financed rather than just paid for cash, if that's the direction of the airport, you may be able to finance it with some type of mortgage and maybe use those funds for other uses at the airport. That might not be on your agenda now, but would that be permitted in the future?
We previously looked at financing, and we found some challenges there in terms of getting a reasonable rate and being able to identify an opportunity. We've, in the past, borrowed from the city, where the enterprise fund is borrowing from the general fund and paying an interest rate. That's something that we're not pursuing, particularly because having a dedicated funding source is pencils out better.
That's good. Great to hear. Okay, thank you. Thank you on that. Let's see, what was the other one? On the thank you. On one of the sources of funds were intra-departmental, I guess, if I could call it that. I don't know how often that occurs, but is that primarily generated from the fees that department would generate rather than, say, specific grants, which could only be used for the uses of that department?
Chair Thompson, Commissioner Campanella, I believe you're asking about the ICS, what we call intra-city services. That is the manner in which we fund those intra-city support services. So, for instance, our facilities maintenance, which provides the maintenance of our buildings, it provides custodial, they provide the support of our telephone and radio systems. It's used by all departments, both general fund and enterprise fund. So we have both unrestricted and restricted funds, and the way that we finance that is we allocate out the services provided, and those departments pay their allocated cost to support the intra-city services. As part of that, we do allocate cost to allow for capital projects at those facilities, predominantly general fund facilities, but also some of our enterprise facilities do have ICS projects at them. And so it's a way of capturing the costs for supporting all types of funding activities within the city and coordinating and consolidating them so that we can provide them from one general consolidated service. So it's not grant funds. It's not. The restricted funds are restricted funds. They're used to support those facilities, but it's done through the charging to the departments.
Okay. And my last question, I'm not familiar with what's going on in cap and trade relative to being able to get funds to the communities. I'm a little bit familiar with what they're trying to do for affordable housing, but is that potentially a source for some of your projects due to their nature?
My understanding is potentially, but I'm afraid I'm not up to speed on that either, and I know that there are some recent developments, but we certainly, as with any state or federal funding, we try and keep a close eye, and if there are opportunities there. This document and all of our planning documents are generally very helpful in supporting our applications for those types of funds.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Commissioner Lodge.
Thank you, Madam Mr. Chair. Sorry about that. Still stuck in the previous chairperson thing. A suggestion, I don't know how easy this would be, but it would be nice to have pagination, and it may be impractical to do for the whole document, but if within, say, Public Works, that section could be paginated for that.
I'm struggling
Look
with the
as if you
same
have
thing.
something
I
to
added
say.
that note. We will see if we can do that next year. It'll certainly make it much easier for reference. It is generated out of a program that has been developed in-house, so it is a little unwieldy, but certainly I agree.
Okay. All right. For me, the priority thing, and Commissioner Campanella and Commissioner Schwartz have already spoken to this, is the police department and headquarters. And I think there's going to have to be some creative thinking about. I don't see any way where funding can be gotten except through a vote. And there's got to be creative thinking about how you can convince the public that this is essential and that they should vote for it. So I don't know what that's going to take, but I hope to see something happening along that line. It says here the staff has traditionally prepared a 6-year plan. There was a time when it was a 5-year plan, according to the charter. And is it correct to assume that when the city went to a 2-year budget, it changed to 6-year? Is that?
I believe that to be the case. I haven't verified that, but it works nicely that when we adopt the 2-year budget, we adopt the first 2 years. We look at the first 2 years of the capital improvement plan as the basis for generating the capital budget, and so they work well together. And therefore, having a 5-year project sort of puts us out of tilt. But then, of course, we are updating it every 2 years, so it extends it out the next 2 budget cycles effectively.
Okay. And then on the next page of the staff report, page 2, it says projects that are not supported by dedicated revenues are financed by the general fund and or the city. Does that just mean other city funds? Because I tend to equate the general fund with the city. But
I think that may just be a typo there. When we talk about the general fund, that is, I think what it means, there are other unrestricted city funds. We do have, but those generally we consider those general funds. So, for instance, UUT and some of our other tax funds they come in to fund the general fund.
Okay. Oh, and then this is under summary of citywide policy regulatory drivers. The second page of that. Oh, there's a punch-through page number there, which I can't read. It lists the land use element, parks and rec element, etc. I think historic resources element needs to be included there.
Thank you for pointing that out.
You're welcome. That's all right then. And then under, this is page 20 of sort of the general stuff. Administrative services. The PEG fee, what does that acronym stand for? Anybody remember?
Chair Thompson, Commissioner Lodge, it's for, let me get that for you. That would be the Public Educational and Governmental fee,
okay.
or PEG fee. It's a 1% fee charged to cable TV subscribers.
Okay, thank you. And then I was puzzled on the following page, Prop 50, Integrated Regional Water Management Grant Programs on funding projects to protect communities from drought. And then it goes through the Creeks Division. And I didn't quite get the connection between the drought and how the Creeks Division projects, how they have related to protecting communities from drought.
Chair Thompson, Commissioner Lodge, the propositions tend to have multiple objectives, of which drought protection is one. Prop 50, I believe, also had an important element to it of preservation of habitat and wetlands. So I think it's just a failure to state all of the objectives of Prop 50. It was more broad than just drought protection. So we'll take a look at that. Thank you.
Okay, it's just perhaps it's just a matter of the wording. That's been answered. A question on the implement media management and storage under administrative services. I've become aware recently of the issues of deterioration with the modern digital, discs and so on. And I don't know if that is something that comes into this, if that's a consideration that, we're not saving stuff on paper anymore, which saves a huge amount of space. But stuff saved on paper lasts for over 100 years or more, while the digital media does not. And is this something that is considered in there?
The challenge is that the volume of records that we generate these days, and managing those efficiently and effectively, and having them accessible, as well as our limited opportunity to store long-term paper records. Frequently, regardless of whether we have them digitally or not, we're also required to keep them as hard copy. So it is, as you pointed out, a struggle to balance the various needs, but we are increasingly reliant on our digital records. Certainly, as we manage our council agenda and so forth, those records are most easily accessed through our digital. And it comes down also to a balance of cost of staff time in terms of recovering them when we get requests for documents. If they are digitally available, that can be a significant time savings there. So it really is that balance. As you'll see, we have not allocated funding to that at this point in time. Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the things that we're continuing to look at in terms of priority.
Thank you. And this is a question about the airport operations area maintenance. The project includes rubber removal on runway such and so. Is this from when the planes land? Just so much rubber comes off the tires?
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Lodge, that's correct. That's a safety measure that has to occur every few years in order to remove rubber that's imparted by landing aircraft.
Does it become a safety issue because it makes the pavement too smooth?
That's correct. Yes.
Thank you. Oh, especially when wet, okay. Well, Commissioner Schwartz brought up the Hollister drainage issue, and that I just want to say that I concur that it seems as if that ought to be sooner rather than later, if possible. But I know it's all this part of this balancing of all these issues. The Central Library ADA compliant elevator, rather pricey item, $1.1 million. And I noticed that the ones for the harbor buildings are, I think they were $350,000 each. Now, I know the one at the library is probably a 3-story one, but I wondered why it's so much more expensive than the ones at the harbor.
I'm going to ask Mr. Dewey to respond to that. I believe it has to do with the size and configuration of it inside internal building.
I'm Jim Dewey, the Facilities and Energy Manager. And to answer your question, This particular elevator runs up the core of the building, and it does go up 3 floors. And so it'd be a reconfiguration of not only the existing elevator, the elevator cab, but it's also a remodel of the areas in order to make the shaft larger. So it's actually extends, it's larger than just the elevator project itself.
Okay, that's a new interior one.
Yes.
There was some mention, I thought, of an exterior one, too.
There has been some plans as far as looking at the possibility of putting in an exterior elevator, and that still needs to be planned, so we don't know what the cost is associated with that yet.
Would that be in addition to the interior one, or?
No, it would be instead of the interior one.
Okay. So that's still being looked at?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And then just a comment, the Central Library roof terrace renovation, that's also out. It's not a very high-cost item. It's out for $217, and it's an area that hasn't been usable for so long. It seems as if it would be good if it could be moved up. Okay, and then I asked about Franceschi House. Sorry to have so many questions. Well, that one was already discussed. There are a couple of sidewalk projects that say this project was identified and separated from the sidewalk infill program due to difficulty of construction and funding constraints. I didn't understand what the issue was there.
I do want to preface at this point we do not have funding for the sidewalk infill project program either, so the separation doesn't really help. But I'll ask Ms. Grant to respond to that.
Okay, thank you.
Chair Thompson and Commissioner Lodge, when we separate out some sidewalk infill projects, it's just purely dollars. So an order of magnitude, I would say if the sidewalk infill was more than about $300,000 or more, then we would call it out as a separate project.
Okay, so it's
and
just
then
a
under
matter
the
of
general
the extent.
Yes, in the general sidewalk infill program, maybe it's doing a half a block or trying to do those segments, and that's, I believe, we have $200,000 per year unfunded.
Thank you.
Commissioner Schwartz, I believe you had a question earlier about the bicycle transportation account. I misspoke to that. It was the funding source is the Transportation Development Act that's funded our bicycle racks, etc. The bicycle transportation account was actually absorbed by MAP 21, moving ahead with progress, and I'll have it reflected in the City Council report. So anyway, several of our programs under the Streets Capital got it's under this bigger umbrella. So we'll be prepared to include that discussion in here.
Okay, that was my last question. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Jordan.
Despite all those comprehensive questions, I can still find a couple more. I'm sorry, but only two. Mr. Bodette, you had a pie chart somewhere in that the set of slides. That was a unfunded slide where your comment was that it indicated a general fund shortage of 35%.
Chair Thompson, Commissioner Jordan.
That might be it. Could you go back one? Or I think it was the one you were on then. So the next one.
Yeah, it was.
So of that, when you look down that list of things on the right that are not general fund, that are unfunded, are some of those categories and the numbers they represent in the pie chart are grants that you would be looking for or normally expecting, or money coming from elsewhere?
So what you're looking at is all these projects are unfunded, and this is over the entire 6-year plan. The 35% you referenced was actually the percentage that general fund had in terms of unfunded projects in comparison to the other projects. So the grant projects, that large piece of the pie there that you're referencing to, that would encompass a lot of departments and various projects that are looking for funding.
So, for example, there's a parking category there, or there's a wastewater there, or a water there. Within those unfunded areas, is it a combination of grants plus money we could choose to raise by rates? So my question is more to what's up there is a mix of, and other than the general fund area, what's up there is a mix both of funds that were at the mercy of somebody else and at the mercy of ourselves, right?
That is correct.
Okay, so that gives the suggestion. I think it would be interesting at some point in future years to show how that breaks out. You know, what we're running from in fear that we're at the mercy from ourselves, that we actually could raise the money, versus what we're actually at the mercy of other people and how that leads to unfunded. Does that make sense?
Chair Thompson, Commissioner Jordan, yes, it makes sense. I think that this is in the context of the council adopted or council approved financial plans that are developed by the different funds. So we do a 10-year look ahead for our financial plans. And then if we have projects we identify that are beyond the funding opportunity of those financial plans, they tend to be shown as unfunded. It does not prevent us from, if we have an opportunity to raise rates, as we do in water and wastewater, from raising rates to make that funding gap. In streets, which is not considered part of the general fund allocation, we don't have that opportunity. That represents a substantial amount, as is the case in some of our other funds, airport, for example. So it's a little bit of a mix there. Some of them we have control over, and some of them we have less control over.
I guess I'd look for a way to maybe to unmix it and point out the fact that part of our destiny we control and part of it we don't. And my other question was regarding the role. I might just have my references wrong, but I think on the Highway 101 expansion project, that is sucked up, or it's continuing to suck up some measure A maybe, that would normally go to some form of maintenance on our city streets. And if that number is $140 or $150 million South Coast wide, what is that number that's, or is there some of that money that would have appeared in our 6-year forecast for projects that's not appearing, and how much would that be?
Chair Thompson and Commissioner Jordan, that's a very difficult question to answer specifically. Back in the day, over 10 years ago, when the state had sufficient funds to put in what they called an RTIP account as part of the STIP program, the city was able to successfully, every several years, get several capital projects funded. And sometimes those were maintenance projects also. Some of the successful projects that we were able to be funded through that program is sidewalks on Carrillo Hill, the base $750,000 for the Ospicitas Cliff Drive roundabout, the Loma Alta sidewalk, etc. Due to a combination of the difficulty of state funds, those were not available until just recently. And then SBCAG board, as you well know, voted that as a South Coast priority that those funds would be set aside for the 101. So that's the background. Explicitly how much funds that is, I can't speak to that off the cuff, but we can certainly provide that information to you.
Significant amount of money every year?
Oh, yeah.
What's a significant amount of money in your mind? Just make up a number for me.
Oh, no way. No way.
Okay.
Police headquarters, $55 million.
But it'd be safe to say that the report can't reflect it because you can't come up with a number, but it'd be safe to say there is a significant effect on the CIP program from that funding shift away from giving it to us versus bucketing it up in part of the funding mechanism for the expansion project?
I'd be very shy of saying the word significant, but I certainly can say the city would benefit from those funds as far as reducing the pavement maintenance backlog.
And as a result, we have to look elsewhere for the funds or defer maintenance.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I've got a few questions for you all. Both Mr. Beaudet's, one of his first slides, and also Ms. Bjork's answer to Commissioner Peugeot both indicated that the first thing you both said was priority is funding. So does that lead us to believe that this is a funding-driven plan as opposed to a requirements-driven plan? In other words, do we determine what we're going to put down as a requirement based upon what we think we're going to get to be able to pay for? And if so, isn't that backwards? Shouldn't we put down what the requirement is and then go look for the funding?
Chair Thompson, I think that we're trying to accomplish that, and I want to try and clarify the comment about the priority is funding. The funding picture sets the framework or sets the opportunity for us to be able to accomplish our capital projects. And because we're looking at capital projects over a range of different funding sources, that makes a different level of funding opportunity in different areas. So, for instance, within our utilities, water, wastewater, and streets, water and wastewater are user fee supported. Streets is tax supported. We can control the funding level for the first two. So even though our priorities might be the same for all three utilities, we may not be able to meet those priorities equally because our funding is limited for some of the expenditures. So the prioritization is really in the context of how much funding is available. It's not that the funding creates the priority, except to the extent that it does allow us to do a project. But so I think the priority is evaluated within the funding picture available for the type of project that's being contemplated, if that helps to clarify that.
Yeah, I understand that. My point is that when we're talking about plans for the future and we are identifying things that we need, it would seem like we ought to identify the requirement first and then go look for whether there's funding to produce what we want to come out of the back end.
And I think to the extent that we have included these unfunded, that we have tried very hard to put everything on the table that we know that we need, as well as why we need it in each of these pages. That's what we're trying to accomplish with the document. And then for the restricted funds, they generally work with their boards and commissions to prioritize how those funds are going to be allocated. For the general fund, because it supports such a broad range of projects, then we all come to the table working in conjunction with the administrator's office to do the type of prioritization you're talking about, which goes to some of the issues like health and safety, critical infrastructure needed to avoid further increased costs, and those types of things. So it's a little difficult because of the mix of funds that we have.
Okay. That answers why it's the way it is. Just bear in mind, from my perspective, I would put funding as the last thing on the list rather than the first thing. And your comment leads to my next question, and that is, we have three categories. Non-essential improvements are what you would think would be the lowest priority, and then essential improvements and essential maintenance, which you would think would be the highest priority. So why would we show any projects in there being funded when they're non-essential improvements, as long as we have essential improvements that are unfunded?
I do not, except for the fact that we have different funding sources, I do not know that we would. I certainly think that the non-essential improvements would get priority ahead of the essential improvements.
Yeah, I don't want to go into detail page by page, but I can point out to you that in there are some projects that are categorized as non-essential improvements, and they show funded. So that would be just my...
And I would need to look within fund to fund, and certainly. And part of it, too, is I think we're sort of new to this, so we're happy to have that feedback, and we'll take a look at it. I think that we are trying to do with those categories is say, we have to have this. This would be nice to have, and this is what it brings to the table. And some of that, what it brings to the table, can be fairly substantial.
Yeah.
So,
well, I think it's an outstanding way to approach these things, but you might want to go back through there and look, because there are cases where you are showing funding is available, funding has been allocated for what you're categorizing as non-essential improvements, and yet there are essential improvements that are unfunded. So you might want to go back and take a look at that before it floats up to the council. A couple of minor things here on page 11, of the staff report, one of the few numbered pages. It says in the second or third paragraph at the bottom says intended to roughly correspond with the term of the anticipated general plan update. I think that I'm not sure why you are anticipating a general plan update, because we actually approved the general plan update 2 years ago. So maybe you need to say approved general plan update or eliminate the word.
I think this may be a failure to update from a previous document. We'll take attention to that.
Okay. And I'd like another couple questions, follow up on one of Commissioner Lodge's questions when she asked about PEG fees. On page 15 of that lead-in staff report, Table A, funding summary, there's several ones that might be questionable there. For example, what is an Aralda Kogan Trust? It's on there as a funding source, but it's nowhere explained. You know, you don't have to explain to me now. I'm just pointing out.
I believe it's a trust for the library, a private gift to the library.
PEG fees, and then RDA is listed on there. Why are we showing RDA as a funding source, even though there is no more RDA and it's all zeroed out?
We still have remnant RDA money that we are expending within this next plan period, including the Cabrillo Pavilion upgrades, where the funding source is indicated as RDA. So it's unfortunately minor number of projects at this time, but we do have at least that one project that's still there.
But it's shown zero. There's nothing shown against it.
But the money was. I'm sorry.
Well, you might want to take a look at that then, because.
Chair Thompson, it's being currently funded, as in right now in fiscal year 15. It's just not reflected on the 6-year plan because the project is ongoing and now. So you'll see.
So that probably explains another question I had, where you show several projects that have the project listed with zero funding for all the out years, but the project's still listed. So we're talking about 2014 projects, but we're showing it on a 2016 and out year plan. It would seem to me if it's in this year, we wouldn't include it in the 2016 and out year plan.
Yeah,
RDA and wherever the funds are coming, particularly the Mission Creek bridges, all fall into that category.
I think the challenge that we're trying to bridge there, and I appreciate the comment, is that frequently we'll fund a project that takes multiple years to construct, and that if we lose it from the capital improvement project, and I think this would be less the case for something like Cabrillo Pavilion, but some of our other projects, we may fund them in the year we initiate them, and then we come back to council and the funding's been encumbered but not allocated to the cost yet. We come back to council when we finally get through all of the permitting and design. Maybe 2 years later, it's nowhere in the current CIP, and it's fallen off people's radar. So for active projects that we're still pursuing that aren't completed, we're making an effort to include them here and show past funding levels so that people will understand that it's still ongoing work and that it will still be part of what is being contemplated of the capital work that we're doing for the city. So that's the intent. I can understand where your comment is from. Maybe we need to make some clarification here.
A suggestion might be to include another column that shows the existing fiscal year as a basis of comparison to the out years, which would then show that some of those projects are being funded in this fiscal year.
And we have done that on the
individual projects.
On the individual pages, but not on the summary.
On the summaries.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Two final questions. One is we have a project in there, zoning ordinance update. I have a hard time understanding how that fits the definition of a capital improvement project. Can you explain to me how this fits your definition on page 2?
Do that. Mr. Chair, I can answer that question. Thank you for that. Well, we as an organization, we did deem it a critical need, and we're not finding the mechanism to fund the effort, and so we did look to the CIP program as a way to do that. And really, if you think about the function of the Community Development Department and the users of the zoning ordinance, it is a critical facility in that it helps facilitate development. It helps people understand how to carry out private development projects as well as public development projects. So we deemed it essential to what we do in community development and development review, that it is like our capital project.
Well, I agree that it's an essential part of our function, but it's a big stretch for me to classify it as a fixed asset, which is what a capital project is determined to be. So that's just, you explained the answer to my question. I guess I still never will understand it.
Mr.
My
Thompson.
final question is very easy. There's one in here about railroad corridor fencing. Does the railroad get involved? Can we go to the railroad to get part of the funding to pay for some of that? I noticed that we show it as a need, but there's no funding for it. And since it's their right of way, are they not concerned, or do they not share in the cost of fencing off their right of way?
Chair Thompson, we do have an existing agreement with the UP Railroad, and we're in the process of renegotiating that agreement, and those 8 areas that we identified for corridor fencing improvements will be discussed with them.
So it's possible that at
yes.
some point in the future on the funding sources, in addition to Caltrans, we might have the railroad showing as a possible funding source for some of these.
It is possible in the event that it doesn't work out. That's why we also might pursue CDBG funding in the future.
Okay, thanks. Commissioner Jordan, final question? Okay, if there's no further questions, we can go into our wrap-up comments. Anybody else have any questions for staff? Okay, Commissioner Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think this is the third one of these I've sat through, and I was worried you were going to point out that paragraph on prioritization on page 4 and say that's the Jordan paragraph, because every year I say the same thing. But I continue to agree with what Commissioner Thompson just talked about on just the sort of the neutrality of this 300 and some pages. To me, the conversations you've had at the other boards and commissions, and even though you're here by a quirk pretty much today, things come up to us by quirks all the time and kind of open the door to talk about whatever we want to talk about. And so, but I think all those meetings and this meeting is the start of the public review and the information that the public should see on what the problem is and how we're going to fix it and what the priorities should be. So I still continue to be, in the big picture, really disappointed that starting at the department level, that the departments aren't prioritizing their needs within each one of their areas. And even then, as an executive summary at the start of this big document, that staff is not rolling those up into a big picture priority. I don't think it's your fault. I think this is the task you've been given to make a neutral document, but I just differ on that task you've been given. It's clear to me that the potential of the police department pancaking is clearly way more important than 95 or 99% of the other things on this list, but it's buried within 345 pages of other documents. That's clearly a discussion that's going to take place at a later place and a later time. but I think there's some worth to have, especially this year, there's some worth to having had those type of discussions out in public right now at the start of the year, given some of the discussions that are going to take this next year. I appreciate the fact that you've got those 3 little bullets at the bottom of the page. In quickly thumbing through the 300 pages, I think probably 90% of them are one of the 2 essential categories, and the remaining few are the non-essential. So I think that's might be a baby step in the right direction, but not necessarily a good step. And what's most disconcerting to me in the whole process is just is the lack of some type of editorial comment that gets us to what clearly needs to be done, say in regards to the police department building, or other things that are just continually eroding the community's sense of being. And, some of the things in there are clearly enhancements to that community sense of being. Some of them are crucial things that are being eroded as we speak. And what's really sad, as I alluded to earlier, in particular talking about parks, is some of the deficiencies that don't get corrected in 1 year are exponentially multiplied in further years. It's just take a park that goes back to nature. It's a heck of a lot harder to bring it back to a park than it would have been just to maintain it every year. And there's probably examples of that throughout the whole document, but that's one that really resonates to me. So I appreciate all the work you put into this. Somebody's going to make a recommendation today to forward this as a recommendation to council. I'm not going to support that because I just want to put a blemish on it, so maybe council will look at it and look at my comments. That'll be the only reason I won't support it, because I get what you're doing. I understand what you're doing. I've heard your response 3 times over the last 5 years, and I get that. But I'm just a little frustrated that I think the resolution, to my opinion, has to come from the top down, and maybe that message hasn't been put up there. So that's how I'm going to attempt to do that.
Commissioner Jordan, if I may just take a moment. The piece that you're not saying, Public Works is the lead to put this document together on behalf of the city. The document is actually transmitted to the council by the city administrator, who will send it with a transmittal letter. I will talk with the administrator. I also want to say this is the first time I've been the recipient of your comments. I think they're very appropriate, and I appreciate them. I think that the place potentially for the characterization and the prioritization is in the administrator's document to the council, and I will talk with him about including those things in that transmittal letter.
Thank you. But I think key to my point, too, is it really starts that discussion for a reason is held in public venues with all the other subordinate boards and commissions. And those discussions and those determinations should be happening with those boards and commissions in a public and transparent method, because it's true. It's, as you said it. I think people have said it several times up here. A lot of the community input will drive those and should drive those eventual decisions. Well, that's where that should start too. At those, if you want to call them subject matter expert groups that are listening to the community and offering their input. And it seems like by the time you get 2 or 3 months later, get out of here, get to the city administrator's office, you're so far removed from some of those discussions that took place just because of the scope and the size of this thing that you've kind of lost that. So I know you understand what I've said, and I will not support it, but it's not for the reasons that you didn't do a good job. I just think the job is just not what I'd like it to be right now, and that's just my opinion. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. After listening to my colleagues' questions and comments, I have some wrap-up comments. First, I'll have to respectfully disagree with Commissioner Jordan.
I'll go ahead and be disrespectful.
No, I don't ever want to be disrespectful. But I'm going to respectfully disagree with Commissioner Jordan on one item. It's not a quirk, by virtue of a quirk, that this item has come to us. And I just want to reference the statement in the staff report, which is that the CIP includes the Street Capital Program review and approval process as required by the city's circulation elements. So there's a very embedded and policy-driven reason why it's coming to the commission. Now, a couple of other comments. Perhaps, Ms. Bjork, you might consider in looking at these three categories, and they've been called out by, including our chair, a number of times, non-essential, essential, essential maintenance. There are activities or there are capital projects that some might consider low-hanging fruit. We might use that informal term, where there's the money, it's kind of an easier to do, still considered essential at some level, however we might want to, kind of define it. So maybe that's a different kind of category. And we have this on Milpa Street. I referenced this on the Mission Canyon Corridor Improvement Project, where maybe until we get a substantial grant over how many millions of dollars we're going to need to make all those improvements, perhaps city and county together could make some important lower hanging fruit, but safety improvement projects, that kind of thing. So to those categories, maybe you can find some other way of describing it that would help us in that regard. And then finally, and I don't want to be overly critical here because in general I'm very supportive of all the work that you've done. But on pages 3 and 4 of our staff report, under the category that's types of capital needs, a question I've had all along and in listening to my colleagues is whether or not this is in any particular prioritization order. Because I would think that if so, these need to be resequenced. And I don't know if that's helpful for you in working with the City Council on coming to a conclusion. Do you see what I mean? I mean, you have contribute to development or implementation of council-adopted plans, but what about health and safety? What about maintaining existing assets for the efficiency of city operations? So you have some bullet points that are lower down. I would think that you and the council would want to consider making those of greater priority. So if this is in no particular order, my recommendation would be to you to actually prioritize them, and that may help with the budgeting aspect. Goes right on to the next page, page 4, under project prioritization. But correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Bjork, these bullet points, starting with functional plans, and then it goes on to neighborhood and other refinement plans, these don't seem to be in the prioritization order that you might recommend to the council, but it's under this heading that states project prioritization. So that's a little confusing, and I'm not sure really is the way you want them to sequence as you're advocating perhaps or recommending that the council consider them in terms of highest priority, and then where you have the funding to satisfy the needs for those priority projects. So with that, I am going to recommend that this move forward to the City Council today, and thank you again very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Commissioner Pujol, and we have a motion on the floor.
I guess that was a motion from me, correct, Mr.
Yes.
Yes, I'll make that motion whenever it's appropriate.
Well, I thought you already made the
No,
motion. You said
I wanted to allow my fellow commissioners to further comment, but I'm happy at the appropriate time to make a motion.
All right, Commissioner Pujol.
Okay. Thank you. Well, the conversation has turned to the overall approach, I think, to the CIP, and you've heard comments from some of my fellow commissioners on that. I don't have a lot to add to that. I know it's basically just some information that you'll probably go back and look at and start over time as this process evolves, which is evolving, and you continue to work on how you put the CIP in context of priorities and what's the appropriate way to do that. The only comment I have in regards to that is that one of the things that we don't see in front of us, and we have very good reasons why we don't have it all in one day or all at one time, and there's the various work programs of the departments, and I know we see the community development department work program. I don't think we see the other work programs necessarily for all the other departments, but at least in what I am accustomed to seeing is oftentimes the work programs will help establish the higher priority items over the next year or two. Maybe they go multiple years. So that may be your current and considerations or discussions so far, and what your future work programs might be one way to help make these priorities in the CIP jive. I'm not sure. It's just a thought. But I do have two items I want to get back to, and they're actually items that I would like to see revised or added to in the CIP. The bulk of the document, as other commissioners have mentioned, is a huge task, and for as large and complex it is, I was surprised that I could find my way around it, even in a few weeks of reviewing it, because it's huge. And so I congratulate you all for the work you've done on it. Again, this is my second time taking a look at it, so maybe it was a little easier for me this time around than the first time. But here are my two comments. The first one is, this relates to the earlier questions and comments I had about basically a safe routes to school plan for the Peabody area between Upper State Street and downtown. And I have this recommendation, and I actually kind of sketched out some wording and some ideas that I'd like to share with you, and I would like to see added into the CIP plan as part of a motion. And it would be something like this. Improvement plans for safe routes to school is recommended in the vicinity of Peabody Elementary School, extending through to the intersection of Alomar and State, including traffic calming, pedestrian, bicycle safety measures. And I would like this statement inserted into already existing project sheets in the CIP, and that statement could go in the Safe Routes to School project sheet page, the intersection improvements, I think that's what it's called, project sheet page, and the school safety zone improvements project sheet page. And then I know that Commissioner Higgins also had an idea or two of some other locations where maintenance or upkeep on speed bumps or speed humps could come into play too, so maybe in those places as well. I don't recall exactly which ones those were. And my second recommendation for a change or inclusion would be to actually add a new project sheet to the list under the planning section for the transportation, Public Works, Streets and Transportation section, and calling that project the city streetscape guidelines, which would focus edge to edge for the city public right-of-ways. I don't think it would be a high-cost item. I don't think it requires outside consultants. And I would like to see that included in the CIP. I think that there's a lot of work that's gone into the balancing of funds and all for this year and this time around. So maybe something that would be like a couple years out to the future, something like that. And those would be my recommendations. Other than that, I am supportive of the draft CIP.
I'd like to ask staff to comment on Commissioner Peugeot's recommended additions to the CIP. Can you accommodate that, or are we too far along in the process to do that?
Chair Thompson, I'd be uncomfortable having them accommodated as a recommendation of the Planning Commission to the Council because they haven't been visited by the primary boards that are responsible for those particular areas, specifically Transportation Circulation Committee and the certainly with regard to the streetscape issues, I would want the Planning Commission to be informed about what elements of our street safety are subject to design guidelines and which are not before having that be put into the CIP, because I would not want the document to misinform. I am very receptive to taking those considerations back, evaluating the appropriateness of either amending the draft or including them in future year CIPs, but to make that decision here and now, I am not comfortable.
So, perhaps you can kind of paint a scenario for me here. How would that work? Like, so, for example, those items would be discussed between now and the next production of the CIP, or when?
in general, how it works with Safe Routes to School programming, we work closely with our traffic engineer and collision data analysis. We also work with Coast as well, that performs and works with the school on safety hazard assessments, and we continue to work with Peabody and all the other elementary schools. We have done some recent projects with them, access ramps at Peabody, but for us to include a really specific scope in our CIP, I'm a little bit hesitant, but it's conversations that we continue to have with our traffic circulation committee, and as Ms. Bjork said, we'd be happy to have that discussion continued there.
So on the Safe Routes to School item, for example, if I understand what you're saying, and maybe I'm not sure I do, but you don't specify any particular, you don't call out any particular item in the CIP, but during the year you have some other process for determining where specific projects would fit in, or does it take a year to bring it back and put it in the CIP?
Commissioner Peugeot, it's for this particular situation, we'd like to keep the general project with Safe Routes to School as a general
unspecified.
Unspecified category. So as projects arise over the next 6 years, again, all of our grant sources have different timing on them. A lot of our Safe Routes to School the next programming year would be under Measure A in summer of 2016. So we always continue to, again, work with the schools, and if there's something that comes on radar in those times, then we would look to
And how does it get on the
formulate a
radar?
project. Again, it's with our traffic engineer and the collision data history and intersection analysis, and also working with Coast and they perform the hazard assessments with the schools.
So how would a project like this get on a radar?
It is on the radar. We have been working with Peabody with some
Is there a way
different
that
ideas.
can be followed through and given some feedback to me on in some shape or
Yes,
another to
I think the
commission?
appropriate direction would to have a conversation in the future with the Transportation Circulation Committee, who is our direct board that we work with and receive feedback on when we have upcoming grant opportunities.
Okay, if that can be noted as a definite follow-through item, that would be a good starting place for me. That would be acceptable for me. I'll let Commissioner Higgins speak for himself about his speed bump item. But and then in terms of the a city streetscape guideline project, is that you, Mr. Kelly, or how would something like that get included and initiated and off the ground?
It'd be helpful if you described in more detail exactly what you're considering, because as part of any capital project that is defined as a project that we have to go in front of the ABR HLC, is that the issue of aesthetics of streetscape is included as part of that review. Now, there could be another project that we could include that would be funding, improving the public right-of-way. We haven't considered that yet, but if that's something that is of interest, we could certainly look at that as an opportunity for improving the aesthetics of the public right-of-way.
Well, when I reviewed this in preparation for today's hearing, I went back to all the guideline documents I could find that are applicable in the city, and we have circulation element policy that leads us there, but in terms of guidelines and basically that provide parameters and direction about what that public space, especially outside the coastal zone where it's a little more unclear whether or not it requires a permit, I had a hard time finding anything that was clearly telling me that there are any design guidelines for those spaces on a consistent manner. And what I'm talking about is not public improvements required by a private development project, but right-of-way design standards. As you know, there was a issue that I expressed and we discussed at length in the museum project about the signal mast arm and its design. And how does that and when does that get reviewed, and where is it that tells me, tells the public, tells the commission, tells the staff that there's some certain basic design parameters and pedestrian scale approaches that need to be adhered to in those kinds of projects.
Commissioner Peugeot, if I could suggest that perhaps a more appropriate place for that is in community development to initiate a planning process similar to the urban design guidelines rather than in a capital improvement plan. Obviously, design guidelines for the city is not part of the capital improvement program, but it would be appropriate for community development if you want to pursue it that way.
I have a short answer, and essentially that is the purview of ABR HLC, and that's part of their assignment, and Renee could probably speak to that in more detail than I can.
That's correct. We would rely on ABR and HLC for consistency in making those decisions as they're reviewing projects like that. And projects in the right-of-way do require ABR review. Of course, downtown it would go to HLC. So it's a balance of if a public improvement project is brought to one of those design boards, it's brought to, as a staff proposal, as a city proposal, and the design board then responds and reacts and guides and eventually would need to approve that. So it's a balance of what's needed and recommended from staff. In this case, with the mast arm for the Museum of Art project, that would be a staff recommended design based on what's necessary for the intersection, what the traffic engineer determines is necessary for visibility, and then in balance with what HLC will find acceptable from an aesthetic standpoint. So there's a give and take. And we do have, although it might not be comprehensive, I think I see where you're going, we do have various documents and guidelines that do help with some elements that are in the streetscape. We do have a pretty standardized set of criteria for, say, MTD bus stops or street furniture, trash and recycling cans, colors that are acceptable in the downtown core, where you place furniture within the streetscape zone. So that there are documents that currently exist that do address that. So, but maybe this would be something we could talk about in a different venue, perhaps next week, even at our work session, if that's a priority.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense, and I don't want to belabor it here, but it's also something that I don't want to get buried in our distant memories because it's an important feature of the overall downtown and city walkability pedestrian facilities. Okay, I'll leave it at that, and I will withdraw my request that it be added as a separate project list with the understanding that perhaps in a workshop or maybe a lunch meeting or some sort of thing with Planning Commission, we can discuss it further. Thanks.
Commissioner Campanella.
Thank you, Chair Thompson. Just a couple of thoughts, perhaps, that I've been thinking about, maybe helpful. I think what we're seeing before us is 1/3 of what a department has to consider in their ongoing operations. And operations are people that you have to match with the capital items, and you also have maintenance. Whatever new capital item you get involved in is going to have to be maintained. So you have to look at that. You have to look at the trade-offs between continuing to maintain versus build something new. We heard some examples of that today. There is a lot of thought that goes into this, and I've had good fortune, I guess, over the last couple of years to sit in on Downtown Parking Committee, which is really, let's say, revenue neutral. They have sources of funds and they spend it. Maybe there's a grant or two, but they have to stick to. And once they get beyond discussions of the next 2 years for their budget and maybe carry over to year 3, it's really questioned, like, why are we doing that? Do we think we're going to be able to do it? And before they stick it in, let's say, as a placeholder for some of the items that they don't know if they are able to have the funding yet, but they want to put it up there because it is something that's going to be coming up and has to be addressed. So there's considerations that go on. I think the first 2 fiscal years are pretty hard, given that people are really doing their budgets. The other thing I wanted to comment on, so that's sort of like what their considerations are. What gets financed, I think, is ultimately going to be up to the city manager and out of the general fund and city council, given what's needed and their vision of the priorities. I think from my standpoint and looking at land use or from the Planning Commission, I haven't seen anything in here that's frivolous. I think the projects themselves are needed, and how they sort of sort out and how it's budgeted, I think is maybe for somebody else really to who holds the purse strings to maybe spend more time on it and make sure it's done right. But I think it's well thought out, especially with no RDA. You have to get very disciplined. Not that I'm not saying RDA was loosey-goosey, but I have no idea that. I have no way to say that. But I'm saying if you're just depending on city money, or if you're depending on grants, the way you put these projects together to get approved is very strict. You really have to know what you're doing, and a lot of care has to be put into it. So I think the care to come up with the projects, the fact that you can't do everything from neither an operations standpoint, personnel standpoint, and maintenance standpoint, I think this represents a real well-integrated picture of what the needs are for capital projects and what the costs are and what the benefits are. So I'm sort of looking at it that way, and while there could be improvements in some of the cash flow items, I think I'm going to disregard that for the moment in supporting of what this package looks like. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Lodge.
My apologies, but there was a question that I skipped, if I may ask.
Oh, no, we're finished with questions. Go ahead.
And it's about the Cacique Street Bridge. The pedestrian, fine, the pedestrian bridge is fine. But my question is, given that there is now direct access to Milpas Street to Cacique under the freeway, that was part of the freeway project, why isn't the bridge itself being replaced?
Chair Thompson, Commissioner Lodge, that has a very long history. That it has been a pedestrian bridge for many, many years, and that goes back. I understood that it was washed out in the 70s and was replaced with the bridge that exists now. At that time, we're still trying to find a little bit about the history about that further back, but as such is that it's been a pedestrian bridge so long that that's the fact of how it exists right now. So way back when the whole idea of the Cacique Underpass was being considered, the neighborhood was solicited as to, should the city put in the 6-year CIP, replacing it as a vehicular bridge or a pedestrian bridge. And as a result of, I understand from the anecdotal information I've been able to gather, that the conclusion was it should remain a pedestrian bridge, because changing it to a vehicular bridge would have a significant environmental impact as far as the number of traffic trips on that street, especially after you connected it to Milpas Street. So you can imagine what would be the route that people would take through the East Side neighborhood with the Cacique connection. That would be the key avenue, and you can imagine the impact to the neighborhood of considerable changing of traffic patterns by turning that into a vehicular bridge. So as such is that from a planning perspective, and it was decided to leave it as a pedestrian bridge.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kelly. I was under the impression that the neighborhood wanted to see the bridge in, but they don't.
Well, it depends on who you talk to in the neighborhood. The people that live on either side of the bridge on Cacique have indicated they do not. People that live on other streets where the traffic would be diverted from would. It's neighborhood traffic is a very, very challenging issue to resolve.
Okay, well, thank you for clarifying all of that. Just a comment, I wanted to say that I really concur with Commissioner Jordan's comments about the urban forest and the importance of taking care of our trees. And, you know, it was a really great urban forest master plan that was adopted by the council, but it doesn't mean anything if it isn't implemented. And I think it's really important that that be done. So, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll disregard all my planning commissioner's comments made earlier about the duration of this hearing, and we'll be eating lunch prior to every single hearing going forward. The one comment I want to make, or I guess what I heard with regard to the, and in relation to Ms. Peugeot's comments, the speed bumps are already in your budget, effectively, in street maintenance. And the other thing that was maybe intimated was that we could take some of this offline and meet with staff separately about putting other capital projects on or specifying them on the budget in certain areas. Is that accurate or no?
I'm sorry, I misrepresented. Speed bumps maintenance would be in our street maintenance project, but new speed bumps would not be.
That's what I meant. Existing speed bumps are already being maintained or at least identified in that part of the budget. And then the other aspect related to Ms. Peugeot's comments, I'd be happy to meet with staff and Ms. Peugeot at a later date about specific projects and how they're prioritized, if that's available.
We'd be happy to be available to meet with you.
That it? Okay, staff have any closing comments? I'm
very appreciative of the time that this commission has taken to review this document. Your feedback is really helpful. We're trying to provide a document that is informative to both our community and to our council, and I really I think you've given it a great deal of review, and I appreciate it, and we will do our best to try and capture and improve the document as we can before it gets to council this year, and look at the opportunities for improving it as a document for priorities and communication in the future. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, and over to you, Commissioner Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am going to move that the Planning Commission make the recommendation to the City Council to support the draft 2016 to 2021 capital improvement program along. Yes, am I on? Okay, Ms. Peugeot says I'm not on. Am I on? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Do I need to go? Do I need to start again? I don't know.
You were on.
Okay. Should we say along with the comments provided today, because I think there have been some far-ranging and substantial comments. I don't know how we capture that in.
Normally you send it forward with.
We'll just let staffs create the summary that's appropriate, along with our recommendation to move this forward to the City Council.
And normally you send it forward with a staff report, right? And you could incorporate the comments from the commission in the staff report.
We will work with Ms. Brooke to try and make sure we're accurately capturing your comments.
Okay, and Commissioner Lodge seconded. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed?
No.
Okay, 6-1 with Commissioner Jordan voting no. Thank you very much. Okay, the final two items we have is our administrative agenda, staff hearing officer, liaison report.
Two minor items last week, just a couple of minor modifications, more related to what was already there on the ground, already existing, so nothing really to report. I think there's just one item on next week, but the 2 weeks after that, there's like 7 items, so probably be a better report in 2 or 3 weeks.
Thank you. Any other committee and liaison reports?
Yes.
Commissioner Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Monday of this week, I attended the City Water Commission. A few items of note. incredible conservation by our community. In December, 33.5% of water conserved. The goal had been 20, but we really stretched beyond that, 33.5, very commendable. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration is predicting above average rainfall for the next 3 months, so we have our fingers crossed there. Mr. Hagmark reported that we continue, as you might have heard at the City Council this week, to use the supply strategy mix that we have been. That's unchanged, even though we have seen some rainfall. It is not nearly enough to fill and spill. Those are the two words that seem to be the lingo in all of our reservoirs and our lakes. So we have to continue to conserve in that regard. In terms of our desal plant permit renewal, it goes before the Regional Water Quality Control Board in their January 29th to 30th meeting here in Santa Barbara. And then up in Pismo Beach, February 11th through 13th, our permit request is going to be heard by the California Coastal Commission. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other reports? I have a brief report on the Single Family Design Board meeting Monday. They had a very full meeting, 9 projects, most of them new construction. And one, again, was somebody built a property that did not comply with the design that had been approved. And it was back for as-built approvals. And the design board did not give them approval for much of what they had already built. So that's still to be determined how that's going to play out, because the house is all built. So the message is still not completely out in the community yet. Okay, if there's no other reports, then the meeting will be adjourned.
To be in love.